Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's bear attack stories, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We'll bring stories from areas near you. Now let's get into the first case. The October morning bit at my exposed skin as I worked behind my cabin. The steady rhythm of stacking firewood keeping me warm. Montana mornings had a way of feeling both harsh and welcoming at the same time, especially this far up in the mountains near Bozeman. I'd moved here 3 years ago, trading my accounting career in Seattle for a remote work setup and the solitude I'd always craved. Just a few more weeks till the real cold hits, I muttered to myself, lifting another log. The forecast had warned of an early winter, and I wasn't about to let my stockpile run short. Last year's lesson of scrambling for wood in November still stung my pride. My phone buzzed in my pocket, probably Sarah from the office wanting those quarterly reports. I ignored it. Up here, work could wait. That was the whole point of moving to Montana in the first place. The simple task of stacking wood, feeling the rough bark under my fingers, and breathing in the crisp mountain air had become my morning meditation. I paused to stretch my back, taking in the view. My cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by lodgepole pines and Douglas firs that stretched up the mountainside. The morning sun painted their tops golden, while the understory remained in shadow. A chipmunk darted across a fallen log, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed its morning song. Then everything changed. The forest fell silent. Not the peaceful quiet I'd grown accustomed to, but an absolute stillness that felt wrong. The woodpecker stopped. The chipmunk froze mid-scurry. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. 3 years in Montana had taught me that when the forest goes quiet, there's usually a reason. A new scent caught my attention, musky and wild, like wet fur and earth. My mind flashed to the bear safety pamphlet the rangers had given me when I first moved in. "Make noise," they'd said. "Let them know you're there." But something kept me rooted to the spot, my instincts screaming that any movement would be a mistake. The crack of a branch shattered the silence. It came from behind me, no more than a few yards away. Every muscle in my body tensed. I'd had bear encounters before, usually black bears raiding my garbage before I got the bear-proof cans. They'd always run away when confronted. But something felt different this time. Crack. Another branch, closer. "Hey bear," I called out weakly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just me out here." The musky scent grew stronger. I could hear heavy breathing that wasn't my own. Time seemed to slow as I turned around, my boots crunching on the carpet of pine needles. The movement felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than a second. And there it was. 10 feet away stood a grizzly bear, its massive shoulder height easily reaching my chest. The morning sun caught its fur, giving the brown coat a deceptively beautiful golden sheen. But there was nothing beautiful about its eyes, dark, intelligent, and completely focused on me. I'd seen photos of grizzlies, watched documentaries about them, even attended ranger-led safety sessions. None of that prepared me for the reality of being this close to one. The sheer mass of muscle, the dinner plate-sized paws tipped with black claws, the dish-shaped face with those calculating eyes. It was nature's perfect predator, and I was standing between it and whatever had drawn it to my cabin. "Easy there, big guy," I managed to say, trying to remember the proper protocol. Was I supposed to make myself look big? Back away slowly? Play dead? All the safety tips jumbled together in my panic. The bear's nostrils flared, testing my scent. A low rumble emanated from its chest, not quite a growl, but a clear warning. Its head swayed slightly from side to side, a behavior I'd later learn often preceded an attack. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. In any other situation, I would have laughed at the timing. Sarah still waiting for those reports while I faced down a grizzly. But there was no humor in this moment. Only the thundering of my heart and the certainty that I was about to find out if my health insurance covered bear attacks. I knew I should stay still, but my body betrayed me. I took one small step backward, my heel catching on a piece of firewood. The The bear's ears flattened against its head. "Oh God!" I whispered. The grizzly's muscles bunched beneath its fur, and in that fraction of a second before it charged, a strange thought flashed through my mind. I'd never gotten around to updating my will. Then the moment broke, and with it, my peaceful Montana morning exploded into chaos and pain. The bear charged. They say time slows down in life or death situations. That's not exactly true. Instead, your brain seems to process everything at once, cramming an impossible amount of detail into each fraction of a second. I could see every ripple of muscle under the grizzly's fur as it charged, count each yellowed tooth in its open mouth, notice how its claws left small gouges in the earth with each stride. The distance between us, a mere 10 feet, vanished in the space between heartbeats. My body tried to move, to follow the instructions drilled into me by every ranger and wildlife pamphlet. If a grizzly charges, stand your ground. Most charges are bluffs. But this was no bluff. The bear's eyes held no uncertainty, no warning, only purpose. "No!" I screamed, the word tearing from my throat without conscious thought. The sound seemed to hang in the crisp morning air, useless against nearly 600 pounds of charging predator. My muscles finally responded, but too late. I managed to half-turn, raising my arms in a pathetic attempt at protection. The impact came like a truck hitting me at full speed. The bear's shoulder caught me in the ribs, and suddenly the ground wasn't where it should be. The world spun, sky and trees blurring together into a nauseating swirl. Time snapped back to normal speed as I slammed into the woodpile. The impact drove the air from my lungs in an explosive gasp. Logs clattered around me, one striking my shoulder with enough force to send needles of pain shooting down my arm. "Help!" I tried to shout, but only managed a wheeze. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, through dense forest. Even if I could scream, no one would hear. The bear's shadow fell over me. I looked up to see it rearing onto its hind legs, reaching its full height of over 8 feet. In that moment, I understood why our ancestors had worshipped predators as gods. The morning sun haloed its massive form, steam rising from its mouth in the cold air. Those dinner plate paws now ended in curved claws that gleamed like black daggers. "Please," I whispered, though I knew bears understand neither words nor mercy. The strike came faster than I could track. White-hot pain exploded across my chest as its claws tore through my jacket and into flesh. The sound was almost worse than the pain. A wet, ripping noise followed by the distinct patter of blood hitting fallen leaves. "Fuck!" The scream ripped from my throat, primal and raw. My hands clutched at my chest, coming away red and slick. Through the haze of pain and adrenaline, I could see 4 parallel gashes running from my left shoulder down across my torso. The quilted jacket hung in bloody tatters, already soaking through. The grizzly dropped back to all fours, its head low and swaying. My blood dripped from its claws, staining the pine needles beneath. A deep rumble emanated from its chest. Not quite a growl, but something older, more primal. Its dark eyes never left me as it took one step forward, then another. My scrambling hands found something solid, a piece of split firewood about 2 feet long. The rough bark bit into my palms as I gripped it. Some distant part of my brain knew how futile it was. Trying to fight off a grizzly with a piece of wood was like trying to stop a landslide with an umbrella. But the primitive part of my mind, the part that had kept our species alive through countless encounters with prehistoric predators, refused to die without fighting. "Come on then," I growled through clenched teeth, pain and terror transforming into desperate rage. Blood ran down my chest in warm rivulets, but the adrenaline kept the worst of the pain at bay. I knew that wouldn't last long. The bear charged again. This time I was ready, or as ready as anyone can be for half a ton of muscle and fury. I hurled the log with every ounce of strength I had left. By some miracle, it struck the bear's shoulder with a solid thunk. The impact barely slowed the charge, but it bought me half a second, enough time to scramble backward on hands and feet like a crab. My back hit something solid. The cabin wall. Dead end. The grizzly was barely 5 feet away now, blood-tipped claws leaving dark prints on the ground. My own blood left a crimson trail across the yard, marking my retreat like breadcrumbs in some twisted fairy tale. The bear's breath came in heavy huffs, mixing with my own ragged gasping. "Oh God! Oh God! Oh God!" I panted, pressing against the rough wooden wall as if I could somehow push through it. My chest burned with each breath, the cuts feeling like they were on fire. The world started to swim at the edges of my vision, blood loss or pure terror. I couldn't tell which. The bear rose up again, this time close enough that I could smell its breath. A mix of wild meat and something rotten. The shadow engulfed me completely. One swipe of those claws at this range would take my head clean off. This was it. This was how I died. Another statistic in Montana's wildlife incident reports. Then I felt it, the door handle pressing into my lower back. A last chance. If I could just reach it, turn it, get inside. The bear's roar filled the world as its paw descended toward my face. Blood dripped from the grizzly's claws in slow, viscous drops. The sight was mesmerizing. My blood, my life, falling like crimson rain onto the scattered pine needles. The bear loomed over me at its full height, muscles rippling beneath its thick fur as it prepared for another strike. Seeing my own mortality reflected in those dark, primal eyes sparked something desperate inside me. "Not like this," I muttered through clenched teeth, tasting copper in my mouth. "Not today." The pain in my chest had transformed into a burning sheet of fire. Each breath felt like being stabbed with hot pokers, the 4 parallel gashes stretching with every movement. But pain meant I was alive, and I intended to stay that way. The grizzly dropped to all fours with a grace that seemed impossible for its massive bulk. My blood matted the fur around its claws, and a low growl rumbled from deep in its chest. This wasn't predatory behavior anymore. This was something else. I'd invaded its space, challenged its dominance, and now it wouldn't stop until one of us was finished. "Come on, move!" I commanded my legs, but they trembled like saplings in a storm. The loss of blood was starting to affect me. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision, and the world took on a surreal, dreamlike quality. Only the sharp bite of pain kept me anchored to reality. My hands scrabbled against the cabin wall, searching for purchase. They found a piece of firewood instead, smaller than the last one, barely more than kindling. But it was something to fight with. The bear took a step forward, then another. Its head swayed from side to side, a behavior I now recognized as a prelude to attack. Time seemed to stretch like taffy, each second lasting an eternity. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew it was useless. The sound echoed off the mountains, coming back to mock me with its futility. "Somebody!" The only answer was another growl from the bear, deeper this time. A warning. This was its territory now, its kill zone, and we both knew it. I gripped the piece of wood tighter, feeling splinters dig into my palms. Blood from my chest wound had soaked through my shredded jacket, running down my torso in warm rivulets. The quilted material hung in tatters, providing a gruesome frame for the damage beneath. "Okay, you bastard," I growled, surprised by the ferality in my own voice. "You want to finish this? Let's finish this." The bear charged. This time I was ready, or as ready as anyone can be when facing down nature's perfect killing machine. I hurled the piece of wood with all my remaining strength, aiming for its sensitive nose. The log spun through the air, end over end. It struck the bear's shoulder instead of its face, bouncing off harmlessly. But the impact was enough to make the grizzly flinch, throwing off its charge by mere inches. Those inches saved my life. I lunged to the side, feeling the wind of its passage as the bear's bulk thundered past me. My legs buckled, sending me sprawling onto the blood-spattered ground. The impact forced a scream from my lungs as my chest wounds scraped against the earth. "Get up!" I commanded myself even as my vision swam. "Get up!" The bear's claws tore chunks from the cabin wall where I'd been standing moments before. The sound of splintering would fill the air as it wheeled around for another charge. I could see my own blood marking its claws like war paint. My scrambling retreat left a crimson trail across the fallen leaves. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony through my chest, but adrenaline kept me moving. I had to reach the cabin, had to get inside, had to survive. The distance seemed impossible, maybe 15 feet, but it might as well have been 15 miles. The bear recovered faster than I could crawl, its massive form blocking out the morning sun as it approached. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who or what I was pleading with. God? The bear? The uncaring universe itself? Another piece of firewood lay just within reach. My fingers closed around it just as the bear reared up again. This time I didn't throw it. Instead, I clutched it like a shield, knowing it would provide about as much protection as tissue paper against those claws. The grizzly's roar filled the world, drowning out everything else, the rustle of leaves, the pounding of my heart, even my own ragged breathing. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that I was going to die. The realization brought with it a strange sort of peace. Then my back hit something solid. The cabin wall. Again. But this time was different. This time, I felt the doorknob pressing into my lower back, cool metal against sweat-soaked clothing. A last chance. One final roll of the dice. The bear dropped to all fours, blood-matted claws leaving prints in the earth as it prepared for what we both knew would be the final charge. Its dark eyes held mine, and in them I saw my death written as clearly as if it were already happened. Reality narrowed to a pinpoint. The door handle against my back, the blood soaking my clothes, the bear's muscles bunching for its charge. The next few seconds would determine whether I lived or died. I released my grip on the useless piece of firewood and focused everything I had left on reaching for that handle. The bear's charge began in slow motion, eating up the distance between us with terrible inevitability. My fingers closed around the doorknob just as the grizzly's shadow fell over me. Time compressed into a single moment of pure survival instinct. My fingers closed around the doorknob, slick with my own blood, and I twisted with every ounce of strength I had left. The mechanism clicked, the sweetest sound I'd ever heard, and I threw myself backward through the opening door. The bear's claws whistled through the air where my head had been a split second before, taking a few strands of my hair with them. I crashed onto the kitchen floor just as 800 pounds of fury slammed into the doorframe, making the entire cabin shudder on its foundation. Close! I screamed at myself, kicking the door with my boot while scrambling backward across the linoleum. The heavy wooden door swung shut with a bang, followed immediately by the impact of the grizzly's bulk against it. Wham! The whole cabin trembled. Dishes rattled in their cupboards. A framed photo fell from the wall, glass shattering on the floor. Wham! Hold! Damn you! I wheezed at the door, knowing the wood wouldn't last long against that kind of force. My chest burned with each breath, blood flowing freely from the 4 deep gashes. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by waves of searing pain and creeping cold. Wham! A splintering crack appeared in the upper panel. Through it, I caught a glimpse of dark fur and one rage-filled eye. My phone. I needed my phone. With trembling hands, I pulled it from my jacket pocket, leaving bloody fingerprints on the screen. The display swam before my eyes as I tried to focus. 3 attempts it took me to unlock it, my bloody fingers sliding uselessly across the surface. Wham! 911. What's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice sounded surreal, like it was coming from another world, a normal world where people weren't being mauled by grizzly bears on their own property. Bear? I gasped, pressing my back against the kitchen counter. Bear attack. Still here. Oh God. It's trying to get in. Wham! The door frame splintered further. I could hear the bear's heavy breathing between impacts, smell its wild musk through the widening cracks. Sir, what's your location? The dispatcher's voice remained professionally calm. 4891 Pine Ridge Road. I managed, reciting the address I'd memorized for deliveries. About 12 miles north of Bozeman. Log cabin, end of the dirt road. Please hurry. I'm bleeding bad. Wham! The top hinge gave way with a screech of tearing metal. The door sagged inward. Stay with me, sir. Help is on the way. Are you somewhere safe? A bitter laugh escaped my throat. I'm in my cabin, but the bear's breaking through the door. I don't know how much longer it'll hold. The bottom panel cracked, and I caught a glimpse of blood-matted claws working at the wood. "I'm dispatching rangers and emergency services now," the dispatcher said. "Can you get to a more secure room?" My eyes darted around the cabin's open floor plan. The bathroom was the only separate room, but its door was little more than decorative. The bedroom loft above would leave me trapped. "Nowhere to go," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "Just this main room. The door—" Oh Jesus, the door's giving way. Crack. The middle panel split entirely, leaving a hole big enough for the bear to work its massive head through. Its hot breath filled the cabin with the smell of wild meat and rage. "Sir, stay with me. Help is coming. Can you tell me about your injuries?" I looked down at my chest, immediately wishing I hadn't. The shredded remains of my jacket were soaked crimson, and I could see things beneath the torn flesh that should never be visible. "Claws? Chest? There's so much blood," I mumbled, the world starting to tilt sideways. "Getting cold. Sir, I need you to put pressure on any wounds. Use clean cloth if you can find it. Stay conscious. Talk to me." Crash. The door finally gave way, falling inward with a thunderous impact. The bear's massive form filled the doorway, its fur bristling, eyes locked on me. Blood, my blood, still stained its claws. "It's in," I whispered into the phone. "Oh God, it's inside. Sir, sir, stay with me." The bear's bulk seemed to fill the entire cabin as it shouldered its way through the broken doorframe. Wood splintered around it as it forced its way in, driven by a single-minded fury I couldn't understand. This wasn't about food or territory anymore. This was about finishing what it had started. My legs wouldn't hold me anymore. I slid down the kitchen counter, leaving a smear of blood on the white cabinets. The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering on the floor with the dispatcher's voice still calling from it. Through the fog that was starting to cloud my vision, I heard something new: sirens in the distance. The bear heard them too. Its head swung toward the broken door, ears flicking at the sound. "Please," I whispered, unsure if I was talking to the bear or whatever God might be listening. "Please." The sirens grew louder. The bear's head swayed from side to side, its primal drive to kill warring with its instinct to avoid humans. For a moment that stretched into eternity, it stood in my ruined doorway, blood dripping from its claws onto my kitchen floor. Then another sound cut through the air, the distinctive whup 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 of helicopter blades. The bear's decision was made in an instant. It turned and bolted through the doorway, leaving my broken door and broken body behind. The last thing I saw before consciousness fled was early morning sunlight streaming through the shattered doorframe, turning the bloody scene golden. The sirens were very close now. "Stay with us, sir. Keep your eyes open." The dispatcher's tinny voice drifted up from the phone on the floor, but it felt a million miles away. Blood soaked through the kitchen towel I'd managed to press against my chest, the white fabric turning crimson with frightening speed. Each breath sent fresh waves of agony through my torn flesh. The bear's shadow passed by the kitchen window. Once, twice, 3 times. "They're almost there," the dispatcher assured me. "For minutes out. Just keep talking to me." "What's your name?" "Tom," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tom Mitchell." Crash. Something toppled outside, probably my carefully stacked woodpile. The bear was circling the cabin, testing its defenses. Each window became a potential entry point, each shadow a harbinger of death. I could hear its heavy breathing, smell its musky scent even through the walls. "Good, Tom. Stay with me. Are you alone in the cabin?" "Yeah." A bitter laugh escaped my throat. "Moved here for the solitude. Funny how that works out." The shadow passed another window, larger now. The bear had risen to its hind legs, peering in. Our eyes met through the glass, and I saw no mercy in that dark gaze. Just patience. It knew I was wounded, knew I couldn't escape. Time was on its side. "The Rangers are bringing their response team, Tom. Highway Patrol is coming too. Just hold on." My vision swam, the cabin's interior blurring and doubling. The blood loss was getting worse. I pressed harder against the wounds, biting back a scream as fresh pain lanced through my chest. Scratch. Claws raked down the cabin's exterior wall, the sound setting my teeth on edge. Testing. Always testing. Looking for weakness. Cold, I mumbled. Getting really cold. That's the shock, Tom. Focus on my voice. Tell me about yourself. Why did you move to Montana? The bear's shadow moved to another window. Through my dimming vision, I could see blood still matting its fur, my blood, marking me as its prey. The morning sun caught its coat, creating a deceptively beautiful golden halo around its massive form. Wanted peace? I said, fighting to stay conscious. Worked in Seattle. Too many people. Wanted. My thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. The kitchen towel was completely soaked now, blood seeping between my fingers. The bear's circuit around the cabin had become a countdown timer, each pass bringing it closer to finding a way in. Thump. Something hit the rear wall hard enough to rattle the dishes in their cupboards. Testing the structure's strength. Learning. These creatures were far more intelligent than most people realized. I'd read somewhere that they could problem solve as well as a 3-year-old child. Right now, this one was solving the problem of how to reach its wounded prey. Tom? Stay with me, Tom. The dispatcher's voice faded in and out like a badly tuned radio. Dark spots danced at the edges of my vision. The bear's shadow passed another window, and this time I noticed something new. It was testing the latches with its claws. Learning. Adapting. Can hear it? I slurred. Still out there. Circling. Waiting. A new sound cut through my fading consciousness, sirens in the distance. The bear's reaction was immediate. Its movements became more frenzied, more determined. The shadow passed the windows faster now, its circuits of the cabin taking on a desperate energy. Crash. Bang. Scratch. The whole cabin seemed to shudder under the assault. The bear knew its time was running out. The predator's patience was giving way to fury. Tom, the patrol units are almost there. Can you hear the sirens? I tried to respond, but my tongue felt too thick in my mouth. The world had taken on a dreamlike quality, everything soft around the edges. Only the bear's presence remained sharp and real. Its shadows in the windows, its heavy breathing, the sound of its claws on the walls. The sirens grew louder, their wailing bouncing off the mountains. Through one window, I caught a glimpse of the bear rising to its full height, head swinging back and forth as it tracked the approaching sounds. Its fur was bristled, muscles tensed beneath its bulk. Then came a new sound, the distinctive thrum of helicopter blades cutting through the morning air. The bear's head snapped up, tracking the noise. Its shadow wavered at the window, primitive instincts warring with predatory determination. They're here, Tom. They're almost there. The helicopter sound grew closer, and with it came the bear's decision. Its massive form disappeared from the window for the last time. Through my blood-loss haze, I heard its heavy footfalls retreating toward the treeline, each step taking a little more of my terror with it. The sirens reached a crescendo outside. Car doors slammed. Voices called out. But I couldn't focus on any of it anymore. The adrenaline that had kept me alive was fading, leaving behind only pain and exhaustion. Tom? Tom, stay awake. They're right outside. The dispatcher's voice faded to a buzz as darkness crept in from the edges of my vision. The last thing I saw before consciousness fled was morning sunlight streaming through the window, turning the bloody kitchen towel in my hands from crimson to gold. Somewhere in the forest, a bear's roar echoed off the mountains, not in triumph or rage, but in frustration. The hunt was over. For now. Sir, can you hear me? Stay with us. A firm hand pressed against my neck, checking for a pulse. The voice seemed to come from underwater, distorted and far away. My body felt like it was floating, disconnected from reality, but the pain in my chest remained, a burning anchor to consciousness. Pulses weak but steady, multiple deep lacerations across the chest. Significant blood loss. Start in 4-line and get pressure on these wounds. I forced my eyes open, the world slowly coming into focus. 2 paramedics knelt beside me, their blue uniforms already stained with my blood. Behind them, armed rangers swept through my ruined cabin, rifles at the ready. "Mr. Mitchell?" One of the paramedics leaned into my field of vision. Her name tag read Rodriguez. "Can you hear me?" "Yeah," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. "Bear. We know about the bear. It's gone now. You're safe." She turned to her partner. "Mike, get that gauze ready. These cuts are deep for parallel lacerations. Looks like full thickness through the dermis." The male paramedic pressed fresh gauze against my chest. Even that gentle pressure sent waves of agony through my body, drawing a hoarse scream from my throat. "Sorry, sir, but we need to control this bleeding." Mike's voice was steady, professional. "Rodriguez, he's going into shock. We need to move fast." Through the broken doorway, I could see more vehicles arriving, police cars, another ambulance, a Forest Service truck. The morning sun caught their emergency lights, creating a surreal disco effect across my blood-spattered kitchen walls. "Bear's tracks head east into the wilderness," a ranger called from outside. "Looks like a large male grizzly, probably displaced by the Wilson Creek fire." "Getting another set of vitals," Rodriguez announced, wrapping a blood pressure cuff around my arm. "BP is 90/60 and dropping. Temperature's down to 96.2. We need to get him to Bozeman Deaconess now." The room spun as they lifted me onto a stretcher. Each movement sent fresh fire through my chest despite their careful handling. The morning air bit at my exposed skin as they wheeled me out of the cabin. "Jesus Christ," someone muttered. "Look at the door frame. Must have been a monster." Through half-closed eyes, I saw what remained of my cabin's entrance. Splintered wood and torn metal hinges, with bloody claw marks scoring deep into the timber. My carefully stacked woodpile lay scattered across the yard like pickup sticks. "Chopper's 2 minutes out," a voice called. "Landing zone is prepped in the clearing." "No time," Rodriguez shouted back. "He's losing too much blood. We're going by ground. Mike, call ahead. We need trauma surgery prepped and ready." They loaded me into the ambulance, the movement sending black spots dancing across my vision. Rodriguez hung and forebag while Mike started the engine. The siren's wail cut through my fog of pain and shock. "Stay with us, Mr. Mitchell." Rodriguez pressed fresh gauze against my chest. "Tell me what you remember about the attack." "Woodpile," I mumbled, "was stacking wood." Turned around. There it was. "Zulfast." "That's good. Keep talking. What happened next?" But the memories blurred together, blood and fur and terror mixing into a crimson nightmare. The ambulance swayed as it navigated the dirt road, each bump sending fresh agony through my body. "For deep lacerations across the chest," Mike called from the driver's seat. "Looks like he's lost at least 2 units of blood. Possible muscle and tissue damage. ETA to hospital is 12 minutes. The forest flew past the ambulance windows, sunlight strobing through the trees. My gaze drifted to the wilderness beyond, wondering if those dark eyes were still watching, still waiting. "BP's dropping again," Rodriguez announced, adjusting something on the 4 line. "Mr. Mitchell, stay with us. Keep those eyes open." "Lucky," Mike said from the front. "Few more inches down, those claws would have hit something vital. Someone was watching out for you today." A bitter laugh escaped my throat, turning into a cough that painted the inside of my oxygen mask with blood. Lucky wasn't the word I'd have chosen. "Rangers said it was probably a male grizzly," Rodriguez commented, checking my pupils with a penlight. "Estimated 800 pounds based on the tracks. Must have been displaced by the wildfires up north." The ambulance hit the main road, picking up speed. Through the growing haze of shock and pain medication, I heard Mike radio ahead to the hospital. "Trauma case incoming. Bear attack victim, male, mid-30s. Multiple deep lacerations, significant blood loss, early signs of shock. Need trauma surgery standing by." His voice faded as darkness crept in from the edges of my vision. The last thing I heard was Rodriguez's urgent voice. "He's crashing. Push another unit of fluids and step on it." Then the forest, the pain, and the memory of those dark eyes faded into blessed unconsciousness. The bear's final roar echoed through my dreams, following me down into the dark. They almost never attack without provocation, a distant voice mused. Something must have spooked it, but I knew better. In those final moments before consciousness fled completely, I remembered the look in the bear's eyes. There had been no fear, no desperation, no mindless fury, only purpose. And somewhere in the Montana wilderness, that purpose still roamed free. Consciousness returned in fragments, each piece bringing with it new sensations. First came the antiseptic smell, sharp and clinical. Then the steady beep of monitors, marking each beat of my still-functioning heart. Finally, the dull throb in my chest, distant now, muted by what I assumed were some very good drugs. "Mr. Mitchell? Can you hear me?" I forced my eyes open, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights. A doctor stood beside my bed, her green scrubs pristine compared to the blood-soaked uniforms of my last conscious memory. Her name tag read, Dr. Sarachin. "Yeah," I managed, my throat feeling like sandpaper. "How long?" "You've been out for about 18 hours, she said, checking something on one of the monitors. "You lost a lot of blood. We had to give you 4 units during surgery. Do you remember what happened?" The memories crashed back like a tidal wave. The bear, the blood, the terror. My hand instinctively moved to my chest, finding thick bandages beneath the hospital gown. "How bad?" Dr. Chun pulled up a chair beside the bed. "For deep lacerations across your chest, running from your left shoulder down to your right ribs. The bear's claws cut through skin, fat, and into the muscle tissue. You needed 127 stitches to close the wounds." She paused, letting that sink in. "But you were lucky. Half an inch deeper and we'd be having a very different conversation." A nurse entered, adjusting my 4-drip. The monitor beeped steadily, its rhythm oddly comforting in the sterile hospital room. "There are some people who'd like to speak with you," Dr. Chun continued, "when you feel up to it. The Rangers need your statement about the attack." As if on cue, 2 uniformed Rangers appeared in the doorway. The older one, his name tag reading Marshall, carried a tablet. His younger partner stood back, hand resting instinctively near his sidearm. "Mind if we come in?" Marshall asked. "We won't take too much of your time." I nodded, trying to sit up straighter. The movement sent a lance of pain through my chest despite the medication. "Take it easy," Dr. Chin warned. "Those stitches need time to hold. I'll give you 15 minutes, gentlemen. He needs rest." Marshall pulled up another chair while his partner closed the door. "Can you tell us exactly what happened yesterday morning?" I recounted the attack as best I could, the memories still vivid despite the trauma. The Rangers exchanged glances as I described the bear's size and behavior. "Sounds like the same grizzly we've been tracking," the younger Ranger said. "Male, probably around 800 pounds. He was tagged last spring near Yellowstone, but the Wilson Creek fire pushed him north into your area. We found his tracks all around your cabin," Marshall added, showing me photos on his tablet. The massive paw prints dwarfed the Ranger's boot placed beside them for scale. He circled the building at least 12 times before the help arrived. Very unusual behavior for a grizzly. "These weren't defensive swipes," the younger Ranger noted, gesturing to my bandaged chest. "This was predatory. He was hunting you." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm hospital room. The memory of those dark eyes flashed through my mind, patient, calculating, purposeful. "The local news wants to interview you," Marshall said, changing the subject. "Bear attacks make for good headlines around here, but it's your call." The thought of cameras and questions made my head spin. "No," I said firmly.
"No interviews."
Marshall nodded, seemingly relieved. "Probably for the best. We've set up trail cameras around your property. If he comes back." "When?" I corrected. Something in those eyes told me this wasn't over. "When he comes back." The Rangers exchanged another look. "We'll increase patrols in your area," Marshall said carefully. "But these encounters rarely." "It wasn't an encounter," I interrupted. the monitors beeping faster as my heart rate increased. It wasn't random. He knew exactly what he was doing. You didn't see his eyes. Dr. Chun stepped back into the room. That's enough for now, gentlemen. My patient needs rest. The ranger stood, Marshall leaving his card on the bedside table. Call us if you remember anything else, or if you want to talk about additional security measures for your property. After they left, Dr. Chun checked my bandages. The physical wounds will heal, she said quietly. But there are people you can talk to about the other effects of trauma like this. I stared out the window at the mountains in the distance. Somewhere out there, a tagged and tracked grizzly roamed free, carrying my blood on its claws. The rangers would search, set their cameras, run their patrols. But I knew it wouldn't matter. You need to rest, Dr. Chun insisted, adjusting my medication drip. The next few days are critical for preventing infection. But as the drugs pulled me back towards sleep, I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes. Not angry, not desperate, not frightened. Just patient. Like this was just the first round of something bigger. Something unfinished. The monitors beeped steadily in the quiet room, marking the rhythm of my survival. For now, 3 days after the attack, I stood in front of my cabin, keys trembling in my hand. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees, shadows that seemed to move and shift with every breeze. My chest throbbed beneath the bandages, a constant reminder of why every rustle in the undergrowth made me flinch. Everything's been checked and secured, Ranger Marshall assured me, standing by his truck. We installed the electric fence yesterday. 7 feet high, 15,000 volts. No bears getting through that. The fence encircled my entire property, its metal posts and wires an ugly but necessary addition to my once pristine piece of Montana wilderness. Next to my repaired door stood 2 bear-proof garbage containers, their heavy-duty latches gleaming in the morning light. Remember, Marshall continued, the solar panels keep the fence charged, but check the indicator light daily. Green means it's working. Red means there's a problem. He paused, watching me stare at the door. You sure you don't want to stay in town a few more days?
No.
My voice was firmer than I felt. Need to face it sometime. The door had been replaced, solid oak this time, with reinforced hinges and a steel core. But I could still see the deep claw marks in the frame, wounds in the wood that matched the ones hidden under my shirt. The local paper had run a small story about the attack, buried on page 3. Local man survives bear encounter, as if what happened could be dismissed so simply. We've got 4 trail cameras set up, Marshall said, pointing them out. Motion activated, infrared for night recording. They upload directly to our system. Any large animal comes within 100 yards of your cabin, we'll know about it. I nodded, finally forcing myself to step forward. Each movement pulled at my stitches, 127 of them, mapping the bear's fury across my flesh. Dr. Chun had warned me about doing too much too soon, but staying in the hospital meant letting fear win. The key turned in the new lock with a solid click. Inside, the cabin smelled of fresh wood and cleaning products. All traces of blood had been scrubbed away, the broken dishes replaced, the scattered furniture restored to order. But no amount of cleaning could erase the memories. Jesus! A voice called from the tree line. Jack Turner, my nearest neighbor from half a mile down the road, emerged from the forest carrying his ever-present rifle. They said it was bad, but looking at those claw marks... Jack! I nodded. We weren't close. That's not why people moved to these mountains. But the attack had changed things. Now he carried news from another neighbor. A glimpse of a large grizzly near Crystal Creek, fresh tracks by the miller's chicken coop. Aha! LF-eaten elk carcass found too close to the hiking trails. Sarah saw something big moving through her back acres yesterday, Jack said, resting his rifle on his shoulder. Couldn't confirm it was your bear, but... Not my bear, I corrected him, the words tasting bitter. Nothing about that thing belongs to anyone. Marshall cleared his throat. The tracking data shows he's moved further into the wilderness. Bears don't typically return to areas with this much human activity, especially after being scared off by helicopters and vehicles. But I remembered those eyes. Patient. Calculating. This wasn't about territory or food. This was something else. Got you something? Jack said, pulling a canister from his jacket. Bear spray. Military grade. Won't stop a determined grizzly, but might buy you enough time to... He trailed off, glancing at the ranger. Marshall pretended not to notice the oversized canister, which probably exceeded legal limits. Out here, survival sometimes meant bending rules. I took the spray, its weight reassuring against my palm. Thanks. Trail cameras are live, Marshall announced, checking his tablet. Getting clear feeds from all 4 points. Remember, the panic button we installed connects directly to emergency services. Response time out here is still about 20 minutes. So don't panic, I finished. We both knew 20 minutes was an eternity when measured in heartbeats and blood. Jack shifted his rifle. You should get one of these. Rangers won't like it, but out here, we recommend bear spray and proper food storage as the first line of defense. Marshall interjected professionally. Statistics show that firearms often escalate. Statistics? I laughed, the sound harsh even to my own ears. Did your statistics predict a grizzly trying to break down my door? An uncomfortable silence fell. The morning breeze stirred the trees, creating moving shadows that drew all our eyes. Somewhere in those woods, a creature that had tasted my blood roamed free. The rangers could track it, Jack could carry his rifle, I could hide behind electric fences. But none of that changed the fundamental truth of these mountains. We were visitors here, tolerated but never truly safe. I'll check in tomorrow, Marshall finally said, heading for his truck. Call if you need anything. And remember, check the fence indicator. Keep the doors locked. Don't leave food outside. I know. After they left, I stood alone in my doorway, listening to the ambient sounds of the forest. Everything seemed sharper now, more threatening. A squirrel's scampering became heavy footfalls. A bird's shadow transformed into a lurking predator. Every sound held the potential for violence. Night would be worse. I knew that without having to experience it. In the dark, every shadow would hold those eyes, patient and purposeful. The new door would feel too thin, the electric fence too distant, the trail cameras too slow. But this was my home. I'd carved out this piece of wilderness for myself, paid for it in blood now. I stepped inside and locked the door, knowing that somewhere out there, something waited, watched, remembered. The scars on my chest throbbed with each heartbeat, keeping time with a primal rhythm as old as prey and predator, marking the seconds until our next encounter. The first time I changed my bandages alone, 3 weeks after the attack, I finally understood what Dr. Chun meant about physical and emotional scars healing at different rates. The wounds had begun to close, angry red lines turning to raised pink ridges across my chest. For parallel tracks, each telling its own story of survival. Looking better, I muttered to my reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to believe it. The stitches had been removed yesterday, leaving behind a roadmap of puncture marks that would eventually fade. But the deepest marks weren't visible in any mirror. My phone buzzed another update from the ranger station's automated system. Bear activity report. No large predator movements detected within monitoring zone in past 24 hours. I'd received the same message every morning for weeks now. The rangers' trail cameras had captured plenty of wildlife, deer, elk, even a few black bears, but no sign of my grizzly. According to their tracking data, it had moved deeper into the wilderness, following the natural migration patterns of its species. Probably for the best, Dr. Chan had said during my last checkup, examining the healing gashes. These wounds will take months to fully heal. No need to risk re-injury. But every night, I still woke in a cold sweat, the dream always the same. Those dark eyes watching, waiting, remembering. The rangers said bears didn't hold grudges, didn't plan revenge. They were creatures of instinct and opportunity, not malice. Yet something in those eyes had spoken of purpose. My phone buzzed again, Jack this time. Heading into town. Need anything? More gauze, I texted back. And bear spray. I'd gone through 3 cans already, testing them at various ranges in my yard. The electric fence hummed its constant reminder of safety, but the weight of the spray canister had become as essential as my keys or wallet. Standing before the mirror, I traced the scars with careful fingers. The flesh was still tender, muscles beneath protesting at certain movements. Physical therapy would help restore full range of motion, they said. But some things would never be quite the same. Time for the morning ritual, I said to my reflection. The routine had become almost meditative. Clean the wounds, apply antibacterial cream, fresh gauze, medical tape. Dr. Chun had shown me how to check for signs of infection. Redness, swelling, unusual warmth. So far, my body was healing as expected. But other healing proved more challenging. The sound of branches scraping against windows sent my heart racing. Every shadow at dusk could be a massive form rising up. The forest I'd once found peaceful now held potential threats in every darker patch. My phone buzzed one more time. An email from the local paper's editor. Mr. Mitchell, following up on our interview request. Your story could help others understand bear safety and wilderness preparedness. Please consider sharing your experience. Best regards, Emma Sullivan. Delete. I turned down 3 interview requests already. The local news had run their story with just the basic facts. Date, location, brief description of injuries. No mention of those eyes, that purpose, the feeling that something primal and patient still waited in the wilderness. Walking to the kitchen, I started my coffee maker, another part of the morning ritual. Through the window, I could see the repaired woodpile. I hadn't stacked logs since that morning, though winter's approach would soon force me to face that particular demon. The ranger's weekly report sat on my counter, its clinical language attempting to quantify my experience. Subject: Grizzly Bear Incident Report # 2024-147. Adult male grizzly, tag # G274. Estimated weight: 800 pounds. Previously tracked movement patterns suggest displacement due to Wilson Creek fire. Current location: last confirmed 22 miles northeast of incident site. Recommendation: continue monitoring. No direct intervention required. 22 miles. Less than a day's journey for a determined bear. The rangers assured me that grizzlies rarely return to areas after negative encounters with humans. The helicopter, the sirens, the vehicles, all should have created a lasting negative association. But they hadn't seen those eyes. A knock at the door made me jump, coffee splashing over my hand. "Just me," called Ranger Marshall's voice. "Morning check-in." He did this twice a week now, though we both knew it was more for my peace of mind than actual security. The electric fence indicator glowed green, the trail cameras uploaded their footage regularly, and the bear, officially designated G274, stayed within its expected range. "Fence is working fine," he reported, checking the voltage meter. "No large predator tracks in the area. Trail cams are clear." He paused, studying my face. "You're looking better." Getting there, I agreed, though we both knew healing wasn't just about flesh and bone. "The department psychologist is still available," he offered, not for the first time. "Trauma like this. I'm fine." The words came automatically now. "Just need time." He nodded, though his expression suggested doubt. "Well, winter's coming. Bears will be heading into hibernation soon. That should help." But we both knew spring would follow winter. And something patient waited in the wilderness, carrying my blood on its claws, my scars in its memory. The rangers could track its movements, monitor its patterns, file their reports, but they couldn't measure purpose. My chest throbbed with phantom pain as Marshall drove away. Standing in my doorway, I watched the morning shadows shift across my yard, each one holding the potential for memory made manifest. Somewhere in the Montana wilderness, 22 miles meant nothing to a creature that had marked me as something more than prey. The scars would heal, the fear might fade, but the waiting game had only begun. 6 months after the attack, I stood in the exact spot where it happened, morning frost crunching under my boots. My fingers traced the scars through my shirt, for parallel lines that had faded from angry red to silvery pink, but still told their story to anyone who saw them. The wooden frame of my cabin's back door still bore its own scars, deep gouges that no amount of sanding had completely erased. "You should replace that frame entirely," Jack had suggested last week during one of his check-ins. No need to keep reminders around. But I'd left it, just as I'd kept the shredded remains of my jacket in a box in the closet. Physical proof that it hadn't all been some elaborate nightmare. The local ranger's case file had been closed months ago, filed away under incident hashtag 2024-147. Bear attack resolved. Their trail cameras had been retrieved, the regular patrols reduced to routine wilderness monitoring. My phone buzzed a text from Dr. Chun. 6-month follow-up tomorrow? 2 p.m. "I'll be there," I typed back. These checkups had become less frequent as the physical wounds healed, though we both knew the other scars ran deeper. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees, and for a moment, I was back there, turning to find those dark eyes watching me, patient and purposeful. The ranger's final report had been clinical and conclusive. Subject G274, male grizzly, has maintained expected migration patterns following wilderness displacement. No unusual behaviors observed. No further incidents reported. Case status: closed. But paper reports couldn't capture what I'd seen in those eyes. Couldn't quantify the purpose behind them. The bear of my bear, as I'd caught myself thinking of it, had never appeared on any of the trail cameras. Had never triggered the electric fence I still maintained. Had never been spotted near any of the local properties. Probably died in the winter, Marshall had suggested during his last official visit. That Wilson Creek fire displaced a lot of bears. Not all of them survived the transition to new territory. I walked to the woodpile, properly stacked again now, though it had taken months before I could make myself do it. The scars on my chest pulled slightly as I bent to adjust a fallen log. Dr. Chun said I'd regained 95% of my range of motion, better than they'd initially expected. Most bear attack survivors have a harder time adjusting, she'd noted during my last visit. "You're handling it remarkably well." But she hadn't seen what happened when the sun set, when shadows lengthened and every rustle in the undergrowth could be massive paws on pine needles. She didn't know about the dreams where those eyes watched, waited, remembered. My phone buzzed again, an automated alert from the ranger's public wildlife tracking system. Notice: trail cam maintenance scheduled for Wilson Creek area. Recent wildlife activity observed. Exercise caution. Wilson Creek, where they'd last tracked my bear before closing the case. Where hikers occasionally reported glimpses of something large moving through the shadows. Where elk carcasses were sometimes found, killed with an efficiency that spoke of experienced predation. "You're getting paranoid?" I muttered to myself, adjusting the bear spray on my belt. A habit now as natural as breathing. The ranger's data showed normal predator patterns. The local paper's story had been forgotten, replaced by newer tales of wilderness encounters. Life had moved on. A branch snapped in the forest, and my heart rate spiked before I spotted the deer, a young doe, stepping delicately through the morning frost. She froze when she saw me, nostrils flaring. We watched each other for a moment, fellow prey animals sharing a moment of understanding, before she bounded away into the undergrowth. My hand dropped from the bear spray. 6 months of therapy, of healing, of adjusting to what the doctors called the new normal. The electric fence hummed its constant reminder of safety. The reinforced door stood solid behind me. The scars had healed clean, a story written in flesh that no one else seemed to fully understand. "Time to let it go," I said aloud, words forming clouds in the cold morning air. Time to move on. But somewhere in the Montana wilderness, something waited. The rangers could close their files, the newspapers could forget, the locals could move on to newer stories. But I remembered those eyes, patient, purposeful, understanding more than any wild creature should. My phone buzzed one final time, another automated alert. Notice: large predator tracks observed near Crystal Lake. Hikers advised to exercise caution. Crystal Lake, 15 miles from my cabin as the crow flies. Less than a day's journey for a determined bear. The rangers would investigate, document, file their reports. Life in the wilderness would continue its ancient rhythms of predator and prey, of survival and adaptation. I touched the scars again, feeling the raised lines beneath my shirt. Physical proof of an encounter that defied clinical reports and official explanations. Somewhere out there, a tagged and tracked grizzly carried my blood in its memory, my scent in its consciousness. The rangers could monitor its movements, the locals could share their sightings, the papers could file their stories. But only I had seen those eyes. Only I knew this wasn't over. Winter would come again, and with it the deep sleep of hibernation. But spring would follow, eternal as the cycle of seasons. And in the shadows of the Montana wilderness, something waited, patient, purposeful, free. I checked the bear spray on my belt, tested the door's lock, and went inside to start another day. Life continued. The new normal, for now. The pre-dawn darkness was just beginning to fade as I pulled my weathered Chevy into the empty parking lot at Glacier National Park. Through my windshield, I could see thin wisps of fog dancing across the pavement, illuminated by my headlights. The dashboard clock read 5:17 a.m., perfect timing to catch the early morning bite. I sat for a moment, double-checking my gear list against the park safety guidelines pinned to my sun visor. Bear spray, check. Bear bell, check. First aid kit, check. The words came out in small puffs of vapor in the cool Montana morning. Despite having fished these waters dozens of times before, I never skipped this ritual. Glacier wasn't like the suburban parks back home in Minneapolis. Here, caution wasn't just recommended, it was essential. As I stepped out of the truck, the crisp September air bit at my exposed skin, promising another beautiful fall day once the sun decided to make its appearance. I adjusted the straps of my fishing vest and grabbed my rod case from the back seat. Early start today, Mr. Hunt? The voice made me jump slightly. Ranger Sarah Martinez was leaning against her park service truck, coffee thermos in hand. Jesus, Sarah, you scared me half to death. I laughed, trying to slow my suddenly racing heart. Yeah, thought I'd try my luck at McDonald Creek. The cutthroat should be active with this weather. She nodded, taking a sip from her thermos. Just be extra careful out there today. We've had increased bear activity along the creek this week. Big male grizzlies been spotted near the berry patches downstream. Tagged? I asked, instinctively touching the bear spray canister on my hip. Yeah, old GB 237. He's usually pretty shy around people, but it's getting close to denning season. They can get a bit unpredictable this time of year. I appreciated Sarah's warnings. She'd been working these trails for over a decade and knew every inch of them. Still, after 5 years of regular fishing trips to Glacier, I'd never had more than a distant glimpse of a bear. I'll stick to the open areas and make plenty of noise, I assured her, adjusting my bear bell. You better, she smiled, pushing off from her truck. I've got enough paperwork as it is without having to write up another incident report. I watched her drive off toward the ranger station before starting down the trail, my gear rattling softly with each step. The morning mist clung to everything, turning the forest into something from a fairy tale, or maybe a horror story, my mind unhelpfully supplied. Hey bear, just passing through, I called out periodically, listening to my voice echo slightly through the trees. The trail was well maintained but narrow, bordered by thick undergrowth on one side and a steep slope down to McDonald Creek on the other. The sound of rushing water grew louder as I descended, drowning out the gentle tinking of my bear bell. Something about the stillness of the dawn made my skin prickle. There was an unusual quality to the quiet, not the peaceful silence of an awakening forest, but something more expectant. I found myself humming quietly, an old habit that helped ward off the creeping unease that sometimes came with being alone in the wilderness. After about 20 minutes of hiking, I reached my favorite spot, a wide bend in the creek where the current slowed just enough to create the perfect holding water for cutthroat trout. The first hints of sunrise were painting the sky in delicate shades of pink and orange, reflecting off the water's surface like nature's own light show. This is what it's all about, I muttered to myself, carefully assembling my rod. The familiar motions helped settle my nerves, threading the line through the guides, tying on a fresh tippet, selecting a fly from my box. I chose a small elk hair caddis, perfect for the early morning hatch I could already see beginning. The first cast went perfectly, the line arcing gracefully through the crisp Montana air before landing with barely a splash. The fly drifted naturally with the current, just like I'd practiced hundreds of times before. Everything felt right, the weight of the rod in my hand, the sound of the water, the growing light of dawn. This was why I drove 6 hours every other weekend during fishing season. That's when I heard it, the sound of branches cracking somewhere in the undergrowth behind me. Not the light snap of a squirrel or deer, but something heavier, more deliberate. My hands froze mid-cast, the line dropping forgotten into the water. Another crack, closer this time, then silence. "Hey, bear," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady and firm like they taught in the park safety workshops. "Coming through. Don't mind me." The only response was the rushing of the creek and the pounding of my own heart, now hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Slowly, carefully, I began to reel in my line, keeping my movements smooth and deliberate. The morning suddenly seemed much darker than it had moments before, the mist more threatening than ethereal. A deep snuffle came from the brush, followed by the sound of something large moving through the undergrowth. Every survival instinct screamed at me to run, but 5 years of park safety briefings held me in place. Running triggered chase responses. Running made you pray. Instead, I reached slowly for my bear spray, unsnapping the holster with trembling fingers. "It's okay," I said aloud, though whether I was trying to reassure the unseen bear or myself, I couldn't say. "Just passing through. No need for." The words died in my throat as the grizzly emerged from the brush like a ghost, its massive shoulder height telling me immediately this was no black bear. This was GB-237, and he was far, far closer than any bear should ever be. Time seemed to stop as I stared at the massive grizzly before me. GB-237 stood just 15 yards away, his brown fur silvered with morning dew, muscles rippling beneath his thick coat. Even on all fours, his shoulder height reached past my waist. My mind frantically recalled the statistics from the park's safety brochure. Adult male grizzlies could weigh up to 600 pounds and run at speeds of 35 miles per hour. Neither fact provided any comfort. "Hey, big guy," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the fear turning my insides to ice. "I'm just gonna back away nice and slow." The bear's head swung toward me, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. I could see the yellow tag in his ear, the marker that identified him as GB-237. Catching the first real rays of morning sunlight. His eyes, small and dark against his massive head, fixed on mine with an intelligence that made my breath catch. My hands trembled as I slowly reached for the bear spray on my belt, remembering the training video's instructions. Remove the safety clip, aim slightly down to account for wind. Spray in a wide sweeping motion if the bear charges. The words ran through my head in an endless loop as I tried to maintain eye contact without seeming aggressive. "That's right," I continued talking, my voice barely more than a whisper now. "You don't want any trouble. Neither do I. Just two fellows out for a morning walk." The bear tilted his head slightly, almost as if he were considering my words. A fish jumped in the creek behind me, the splash shattering the tension. The bear's ears flicked forward, and I saw his weight shift subtly. Every wilderness safety course I'd taken screamed through my mind. Bears that stop and stare, especially with ears forward, are likely to charge. "Hey, bear," I shouted with as much authority as I could muster, making myself appear larger by raising my arms. It was the last-ditch effort recommended by experts when a bear showed signs of aggression. "Go away," GB-237 responded with a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. His lips curled back, revealing yellowed teeth the length of my fingers. I had a sudden, hysterical thought about how the park's information center displayed a cast of a grizzly's jaw, but nothing could have prepared me for seeing those teeth in the flesh. "Please," I whispered, though I knew bears couldn't understand human desperation. "Please don't." The radio at my hip crackled to life, making us both jump. Sarah Martinez's voice cut through the morning air. Base to all units. Be advised we have reports of... The sudden noise was too much. The bear's muscles bunched beneath his fur, a movement I recognized from countless nature documentaries, but never thought I'd see up close. Time slowed to a crawl as GB-237 rose to his full height, towering over me at nearly 8 feet tall. I managed to pull the bear spray free, but my fingers fumbled with the safety clip. The plastic safety tab seemed impossibly small, designed for calmer hands than mine. A distant part of my brain noted the absurdity of focusing on such a tiny piece of plastic while facing certain death. Base to hunt, come in. Jeremy, you on the creek this morning? Sarah's voice continued from the radio, unaware of the drama unfolding. I couldn't spare a hand to respond, couldn't take my eyes off the bear, couldn't do anything but watch as the massive predator made his decision. The grizzly dropped back to all fours, and for a fraction of a second, I felt hope surge through me. Then I saw his head lower, another classic sign of an impending charge. The safety clip finally came free from the bear spray, the small plastic piece falling silently to the rocky shore. "Oh God!" I breathed, as the bear's powerful rear legs tensed. The distance between us vanished in an instant. People always talk about how fast bears can run, but numbers and statistics don't prepare you for the reality. One moment GB-237 was 15 yards away. The next he was launching himself toward me with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. The morning air filled with a roar that shook leaves from the trees and sent birds scattering into the brightening sky. I had time for one coherent thought. I should have listened to Sarah, before 600 pounds of muscle and fury crashed into my world. My last clear image was of those small, dark eyes locked onto mine, showing neither hatred nor mercy, just the pure, unthinking instinct of a wild creature defending its territory. In that final moment before impact, I understood with perfect clarity that I wasn't about to be attacked by a monster or a villain, but by something far more terrifying, a force of nature that operated beyond human concepts of right and wrong. The bear spray canister was up and aimed, my finger on the trigger, but I already knew it would be too late. The morning sun caught GB-237's fur as he launched through the air, turning him into a creature of bronze and fire. His massive paws, tipped with black claws as long as my hand, reached for me. The crisp Montana morning, so peaceful moments before, erupted into chaos as the space between predator and prey disappeared entirely. The impact felt like being hit by a freight train. One moment I was standing, the next I was slammed into the rocky shore with such force that all air exploded from my lungs. The bear spray canister flew from my grip, skittering across the stones just out of reach. The world became a chaos of fur, teeth, and overwhelming pressure. Hot breath filled my nostrils, a horrific mixture of rotting fish and raw meat that made my stomach lurch. GB-237's massive head swung down, jaws snapping inches from my face. I could feel the wind from each bite, hear the click of teeth meeting teeth where my head had been a fraction of a second before. "Help!" I tried to scream, but it came out as more of a wheeze. The bear's weight was crushing me into the ground, each movement threatening to crack my ribs. "Someone, please." My left arm shot up instinctively as the bear's jaws came down again. A mistake I realized too late. Pain exploded through my forearm as claws raked across it, the sound of tearing fabric mixing with my own screams. I felt hot wetness running down my arm, but couldn't tell if it was blood or bear saliva. "Get off!" I roared, terror and adrenaline temporarily overwhelming the pain. I kicked out with my legs, trying to remember the self-defense techniques from the park's bear awareness course. But all the training in the world couldn't have prepared me for the sheer, overwhelming mass of an adult grizzly. GB-237 shifted his weight, one massive paw pressing down on my chest. Each breath became a struggle, spots dancing at the edges of my vision. The bear's head weaved above me, his hot breath washing over my face as he decided where to bite. I could see every detail of his face, the scarred muzzle, the yellowish teeth, those dark eyes that held no malice, just focused intent. "Our father," who art in heaven. I found myself mumbling, memories of childhood prayers surfacing in what I was certain were my final moments. The radio at my hip crackled again. Jeremy, come in. We've got reports of bear activity in your area. Sarah's voice was distant, tinny, almost comical in its understatement. The bear's attention shifted slightly at the sound, his head turning toward the noise. In that moment of distraction, my hand brushed against something solid, the bear spray canister, just barely within reach. Moving as slowly as I dared, my fingers closed around it. Please work, I whispered, thumb finding the trigger. Please work. I remembered the training video's warnings about bear spray. In close quarters, the spray will likely affect both you and the bear. Prepare for severe irritation to eyes, nose, and throat. They weren't kidding. I somehow managed to trigger the bear spray, and the world disappeared in a cloud of burning orange mist. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. It felt like my face was on fire, like I'd stuck my head into a vat of boiling pepper sauce. But GB-237 got it worse. The bear reared back with a roar that seemed to shake the very mountains, his massive form silhouetted against the morning sky. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, primal pain and rage that resonated in my bones. His paw caught my shoulder as he reeled backward, claws tearing through my jacket and into flesh. I rolled to my side, coughing and retching as the bear spray burned through my sinuses. Every movement sent waves of pain through my shredded arm, but instinct drove me to move. Have to. Get away, I gasped between coughs. Have to. GB-237 was thrashing nearby, his massive form barely visible through my tears. The bear's roars had transformed into what almost sounded like whimpers. Terrible sounds from such a powerful creature. He shook his head violently, trying to clear the burning spray from his eyes and nose. I attempted to stand, but my legs gave out, sending me crashing back to the rocky shore. The world spun sickeningly, shock and bear spray making it impossible to find balance. Blood dripped steadily from my left arm, creating small dark pools between the river rocks. Jeremy! Jeremy! Sarah's voice was closer now, accompanied by the sound of a vehicle engine. Hold on. I'm coming. The bear's head snapped up at the new sounds, nostrils flaring despite the pepper spray. For a moment, our eyes met again through the orange haze. There was something different in his gaze now. Confusion maybe? Or simply the overwhelming need to escape the burning chemical fog. GB-237 swung his head back and forth once more, then turned and crashed into the underbrush. The sound of breaking branches and his pained huffs grew fainter as he retreated, leaving behind only the rushing of the creek and my own ragged breathing. I lay there on the blood-spotted rocks, every breath burning from the bear spray, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through my savaged arm. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the scene of devastation. My shredded backpack, the scattered fishing gear, dark patches of blood on pale stone. Still alive? I whispered to myself, though it came out as more of a sob. Still alive. A fresh wave of pain washed over me as shock began to fade, and I realized I needed to get help before GB-237 decided to return. But my body refused to cooperate, muscles trembling from adrenaline and trauma. The sound of tires on gravel and running footsteps approached from the trail above. Oh my God! Sarah's voice floated down. Jeremy, don't move. I'm calling this in. I tried to respond, but could only manage a weak cough, the bear spray still burning my throat. As consciousness began to fade around the edges, I caught one last glimpse of movement in the trees where GB-237 had disappeared. A flash of brown fur, already becoming like something from a nightmare. Jeremy, stay where you are. Help is coming. Sarah's voice seemed to come from a great distance, distorted by the ringing in my ears. But a fresh crash in the underbrush galvanized me into action. GB-237 wasn't done with me yet. I scrambled backward on all fours, rocks cutting into my palms as I half crawled, half ran toward the water. Each movement sent lightning bolts of pain through my shredded arm, but terror proved stronger than agony. Behind me, I could hear the bear's labored breathing as it recovered from the spray, punctuated by angry huffs that grew closer with each passing second.
No, Jeremy.
Don't go in the water. Sarah's warning came too late. The current hit me like a sledgehammer as I plunged into McDonald Creek, the glacial water stealing what little breath I had left. September in Montana meant the creek was filled with snowmelt, and the shock of cold nearly paralyzed me on the spot. My boots, suddenly leaden, dragged at my legs as the current grabbed hold. Jesus, cold. I gasped, my teeth already chattering violently. The bear's angry bellows from the shore drove me deeper despite my body's protests. The current tugged at my clothes, trying to pull me under, while blood from my wounds created lazy crimson spirals in the crystal-clear water. Through vision blurred by bear spray and tears, I watched GB-237 pace the riverbank. His massive form weaved back and forth, clearly debating whether to follow. The spray had left his face wet and matted, and strings of saliva hung from his jaws as he shook his head repeatedly, still trying to clear the burning sensation. "That's right," I mumbled through chattering teeth. "Stay there, you bastard. Stay there." The cold was becoming dangerous. I could feel my movements growing sluggish, my thoughts becoming muzzy. The current kept trying to spin me around, to drag me into deeper water. My torn arms screamed in protest as I fought against the flow, trying to angle myself toward the opposite shore while keeping distance between myself and the bear. "Jeremy!" Sarah's voice echoed across the water. "Grab something. The current's too strong." She was right. I was being swept downstream faster than I'd realized. The creek, so peaceful during my fishing trips, had transformed into a ruthless force of nature. Rocks rushed past beneath the surface, threatening to catch my feet and drag me under. The weight of my waterlogged clothes pulled at me like hungry hands. GB-237 followed my progress along the shore, moving with surprising grace for something so large. Even through my panic and pain, I couldn't help but admire his fluid movement, like a furry freight train rolling along the riverbank. Then he did something that made my blood run colder than the creek water. He began to angle downstream, cutting the corner while I was forced to follow the current's curve. No, no, no. I tried to kick harder, to swim faster, but the cold had sapped my strength. My wounded arm hung uselessly at my side, leaving me to fight the current one-handed. The shore seemed impossibly far away. A fallentre. It loomed ahead, its branches reaching into the creek like skeletal fingers. I had a split-second choice. Risk getting tangled in the branches or let the current sweep me further downstream where GB-237 was headed. "Grab the tree," Sarah shouted, and I could see her running along the opposite shore, her radio raised to her mouth as she called for backup. I lunged for the nearest branch, my good hand closing around rough bark. The current instantly tried to tear me away, threatening to dislocate my shoulder. But the alternative was worse. Using the last reserves of my strength, I pulled myself toward the tangle of branches. Through the spray and mist, I saw GB-237 stop at the bend. The bear rose onto his hind legs again, sniffing the air. Even from 30 yards away, his size was intimidating. Water dripped from his fur where he'd splashed along the shore, and his breath came out in visible puffs in the cool morning air. The moments stretched into eternities as I hung there, shivering violently in the frigid water. My body was screaming for warmth, for rest, for an end to this nightmare. But all I could do was watch the grizzly and wait. "Jeremy!" Sarah's voice was closer now. "Can you make it to this side? I've got a rescue team 3 minutes out." I tried to answer, but my voice wouldn't work properly. The cold had reached my bones, making even the simple act of holding onto the branch a monumental effort. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision, hypothermia setting in fast. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, GB-237 dropped back to all fours. He gave one last huff in my direction, then turned and ambled into the forest with surprising casualness, as if our encounter had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his morning routine. He's leaving," I managed to croak. "Hold on." Sarah called. Just hold on a little longer. My grip on the branch was weakening. The current pulled at my legs, trying to suck me under the fallen tree. My torn arm throbbed in time with my heartbeat, leaving trails of pink in the clear water. The opposite shore wavered in and out of focus as hypothermia tightened its grip. The last thing I clearly remember is the sound of approaching sirens, the sensation of rough bark under my fingers, and the bone-deep cold of the creek. Then darkness crept in from the edges, and I felt myself slipping away into the glacial water, my body becoming numb from a combination of cold, blood loss, and sheer exhaustion. As consciousness faded, I had one final, oddly peaceful thought. At least the bear spray had worked. I don't remember dragging myself onto the opposite shore, just fragments of sensation. Rough hands pulling me from the water, voices shouting instructions, the squeal of radio static. The world existed in disconnected snapshots, like a damaged film reel jumping between scenes. Patient is male, mid-30s, severe lacerations to left arm and shoulder, showing signs of hypothermia. An unfamiliar voice cut through the haze. Get those wet clothes off him now. My body felt impossibly heavy as emergency responders stripped away my sodden clothing. Every movement sent waves of agony through my shredded arm, but the pain seemed distant somehow, like it belonged to someone else. The morning sun felt obscenely cheerful against my closed eyelids. Jeremy? Jeremy? Can you hear me? Sarah's voice penetrated the fog. Stay with us. Okay? The EMTs are here. I tried to respond, but could only manage a weak cough, still feeling the burn of bear spray in my throat. River water dribbled from my mouth, tasting of copper and fear. Someone wrapped an emergency blanket around my shoulders, the metallic material crinkling loudly in my ears. Core temperatures down to 94.6, another voice reported. We need to get him warmed up stat. Careful with that arm, someone else warned. Looks like deep tissue damage, possible arterial involvement. The sound of my own ragged breathing seemed thunderous as hands expertly examined my wounds. Each touch sent fresh spikes of pain through my battered body. I could hear the rush of the creek nearby, a sound that had once been soothing but now carried only terror. Sarah, I managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper. The bear. Don't try to talk, she replied, and I felt her hand squeeze my uninjured one. GB 237 is gone. We've got rangers tracking him now, making sure he heads back up into the high country. A sharp prick in my arm announced the insertion of an 4. The warmth of the fluid spreading through my veins was the first pleasant sensation I'd felt since the attack. Slowly, the violent shivering began to ease. BP's stabilizing, someone reported. Let's get him on the backboard. Watch the arm. On my count. 1, 2, 3. The world tilted sickeningly as they lifted me. Stars exploded behind my closed eyelids, and I heard someone make a sound between a groan and a whimper. Took me a moment to realize it had come from me. Hang in there, Jeremy. Sarah's voice followed me. The chopper's almost here. As if summoned by her words, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter blades cut through the morning air. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the rustle of tree branches being buffeted by the downdraft. Life flights here, one of the EMTs announced. They'll have him at Kalispell Regional in 15 minutes. I forced my eyes open, struggling to focus. The world was a blur of movement and color. Through the haze, I caught glimpses of the scene. Sarah's worried face, EMTs in their blue uniforms, the red and white helicopters settling onto the Park Service access road. Behind them all, the dark line of trees where GB-237 had disappeared seemed to watch with malevolent patience. Multiple lacerations, hypothermia, bear attack. The information was passed to the flight crew in clipped, professional tones. Lost consciousness in the water. Every movement sent waves of agony through my body as they transferred me to the helicopter stretcher. The bear spray still burned in my nose and throat, mixing with the metallic taste of blood and river water. My torn arm throbbed in time with my heartbeat, each pulse a reminder that I was, against all odds, still alive. I'll meet you at the hospital, Sarah called over the sound of the rotors. Just stay with us, okay? The helicopter door slid shut with a mechanical clunk, sealing me into a world of beeping monitors and efficient hands. As we lifted off, I caught one final glimpse through the window, the creek glinting in the morning sun, the scattered remnants of my fishing gear, the dark stains on the rocks where my blood had spilled. Starting another unit of warm fluids, someone announced above me, "Sir, can you tell me your name?" "Jeremy," I managed. "Jeremy Hunt." "Good. Stay with me, Jeremy. You're doing great." But the darkness was creeping in again, more insistent this time. The steady thrum of the helicopter blades began to fade, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in my ears. I thought I could smell the bear's breath again, that horrific mixture of rotting meat and wild animal. But that was impossible here in the sterile confines of the helicopter. BP's dropping. Push more fluids. Losing him. The last thing I saw before passing out was the Rocky Mountains sliding past beneath us, ancient and indifferent to the drama playing out in their shadow. Somewhere down there, GB-237 was probably already marking the encounter as just another morning in his territory, while I was being rushed to surgery with my life literally hanging by a thread. When I finally collapsed on the hospital's doorstep over an hour later, I was only vaguely aware of the shocked face of the staff as they rushed me inside. My clothes were in tatters and covered in my own blood, my skin a mottled canvas of bruises and lacerations. I heard someone call for a trauma team, heard the squeak of gurney wheels on linoleum. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me completely was a clock on the wall reading 7:42 a.m. Somehow, impossibly, less than 3 hours had passed since I'd pulled into that empty parking lot, ready for a peaceful morning of fishing. The steady beep of heart monitors slowly pulled me back to consciousness. At first, everything was white ceiling, white walls, white sheets. The harsh fluorescent lights made my eyes water, and for a moment, I thought I was still caught in the bear spray cloud. "Welcome back, Mr. Hunt." A woman in blue scrubs appeared at my bedside, adjusting something on one of the 4 bags. Her name tag read, "Der Chen." "How's the pain level?" "Scale of 1 to 10. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like I'd swallowed glass. A straw appeared at my lips, and the cool water was the most wonderful thing I'd ever tasted. 8, I managed to croak. "Maybe 9. She nodded, making a note on her tablet. "That's to be expected. You've been through quite an ordeal. I'm going to increase your pain medication slightly." As the fresh wave of drugs entered my system, the sharp edges of agony began to blur. I became aware of my left arm, immobilized and heavily bandaged, elevated on a pillow beside me. The memory of GB-237's claws raking across my flesh flashed through my mind, making me flinch. "Try to stay still," Dr. Chun advised. "The wounds are extensively sutured. You have severe lacerations to your left arm and shoulder, with significant muscle damage. We're particularly concerned about potential nerve injury in your forearm." The clinical terms washed over me like white noise. Through the haze of painkillers, I caught phrases that would have terrified me if I'd been more alert. Extensive soft tissue damage, possible tendon involvement, risk of infection, physical therapy assessment. Am I? I had to pause to wet my lips. Will I lose the arm? No, you were fortunate in that regard. The bear's claws missed the major arteries. But you're looking at several months of recovery and rehabilitation. You lost a significant amount of blood, both from the initial attack and your time in the creek. A knock at the door interrupted us. Sarah Martinez stood there, still in her ranger uniform, looking exhausted. "Hey, survivor, mind if I come in?" Dr. Chun checked her watch. 10 minutes, then he needs rest. "And rangers," she paused at the door. "Try not to excite him. His blood pressure is still unstable." Sarah pulled up a chair, and I noticed she wasn't alone. A man in a sheriff's uniform followed her in, notebook already in hand. "Jeremy, this is Sheriff Mike Dawson. We need to take your statement while the details are still fresh. Think you're up for it?" I nodded weakly, and for the next several minutes, I recounted everything I could remember. The beautiful morning, the warning signs I'd missed, the terrible speed of the attack. The sheriff's pen scratched across his notepad as I described GB 237's appearance, behavior, and movements. The bear spray certainly saved your life, Sarah commented when I finished. But getting into the creek was incredibly risky. Your lucky hypothermia didn't kill you. Wasn't thinking clearly, I admitted. Just needed to get away. The sheriff cleared his throat. Unfortunately, without any photos or video evidence, this will go down as just another bear incident report. GB 237 was acting territorially, not predatorily, so there won't be any action taken against him. You mean he's still out there? My heart monitor betrayed my spike of anxiety with a quickened beeping. He's been tagged and tracked for years, Sarah explained. This is the first aggressive interaction he's had with humans. Given the time of year and his previous behavior patterns, we believe this was a defensive reaction, not predatory intent. Through the window, I could see a local news van pulling into the hospital parking lot. Sarah followed my gaze and grimaced. They're running a small story about a bear incident at Glacier, she said. We're keeping your name out of it to avoid media circus. These things tend to get sensationalized. Yeah. I managed a weak laugh that pulled at my injuries. Guess man annoys bear. Gets what's coming isn't much of a headline. The sheriff stood, pocketing his notebook. Get some rest, Mr. Hunt. We'll need you to sign some formal statements once you're feeling stronger. As they turned to leave, Sarah paused at the door. Jeremy? For what it's worth, you did everything by the book. Sometimes nature just reminds us who's really in charge up there. After they left, I lay in the growing darkness as night settled over Kalispell Regional Medical Center. Every shadow in the room seemed to hold the shape of a bear, every sound a distant growl. The pain medication made the world soft around the edges, but couldn't quite dull the memory of hot breath and crushing weight. A nurse came in to check my vitals, her shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum floor. Try to get some sleep, she advised, adjusting my morphine drip. Dr. Chun will be back in the morning to discuss your recovery plan. But sleep seemed impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw GB 237 rising up before me, massive and unstoppable. The steady beep of monitors became the tinking of my bear bell. The hum of the hospital air conditioning transformed into the rush of McDonald Creek. You're safe, I whispered to myself in the darkness. You're safe now. But as I drifted in and out of consciousness, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in Glacier National Park, a massive grizzly was bedding down for the night, already forgetting our encounter while I lay here permanently marked by it. The thought would haunt my dreams for months to come. How something so monumentally terrible to me could be just another day in the life of a wild creature. The local news would run their story tomorrow, a brief mention of increased bear activity in the park, a warning for visitors to be cautious. But without photos or video evidence, without any proof beyond my scars and my word, it would fade quickly from public attention. Just another cautionary tale about the risks of wilderness recreation. In the darkness of my hospital room, that somehow seemed fitting. 2 days after the attack, Sarah Martinez visited me again, this time carrying a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. The morning sun streaming through my hospital window did little to warm the chill that settled in my stomach when I saw the incident report header. How are you holding up? She asked, pulling the visitor's chair closer to my bed. The dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't been sleeping much either. Better, I lied, adjusting my position with my good arm. The other remained heavily bandaged, a constant reminder of how close I'd come to death. Dr. Chan says the infection risk is lower than they initially feared. Sarah nodded, then opened the folder. I thought you might want to see what we found during our sweep of the area. She spread several photographs across my blanket-covered lap. These were taken about 2 hours after we got you out. The first image showed my abandoned fishing gear, the rod broken into pieces, tackle box spilled across blood-stained rocks. My throat tightened at the sight. We followed the blood trail, Sarah continued, her voice professional but gentle. Both yours and the bear's. The spray left quite a bit of evidence behind. GB-237 was bleeding slightly from some scratches he got during the attack, probably from the rocks or branches. She showed me another photo, massive paw prints in the mud near the creek bank, a ruler placed beside them for scale. Each print was bigger than my hand. These match GB-237's known prints, she explained. We've been tracking him for years. He was originally tagged in 2019 during a routine population study. She pulled out an older photo showing the same bear, slightly younger but still massive, being worked on by a wildlife team while sedated. How big is he exactly? I found myself asking, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Based on our last measurements and recent trail cam footage, we estimate he's around 600 pounds, maybe more this close to denning season. She pulled out another photograph, this one from a trail camera dated just a week before my attack. The image showed GB-237 passing silently through a forest clearing, massive and proud in the infrared lighting. This was his territory long before it was a national park, Sarah continued. He's never shown aggressive behavior before, but bears can be unpredictable this time of year. They're focused on putting on weight for winter, and anything that seems like a threat to their food sources or territory can trigger a defensive response. A chill ran down my spine as she showed me more trail camera shots. GB-237 fishing in the creek, marking trees, moving through his domain with the confidence of an apex predator. In one night vision image, he passed so close to the camera that you could see the yellow tag in his ear glinting in the infrared light. What? I had to swallow hard before continuing. What happens to him now? Sarah sighed, gathering the photos back into her folder. The Park Service can't justify removing him from his territory. The attack was defensive, not predatory. You didn't have food with you that might have attracted him, and he didn't try to feed on you after the attack. From a wildlife management perspective, this was just nature being nature. Just nature being nature, I repeated softly, looking down at my bandaged arm. Tell that to my physical therapist. I know it's hard to understand, Sarah said, pulling out one final document, a map marked with colored pins showing GB-237's known territory and movement patterns. But he's actually a valuable part of the ecosystem. His presence helps maintain the natural balance in that part of the park. I studied the map, noting how my fishing spot had been right on the edge of the bear's most frequently used paths. If he's so well known, why wasn't there more warning about his presence in the area? We had posted additional warning signs that morning, Sarah admitted, looking uncomfortable. But we hadn't gotten to all the access points yet. Your parking spot was next on our route. I was actually heading there when... She trailed off, the guilt evident in her voice. It's not your fault, I assured her, though part of me wanted to be angry at someone, something other than an animal that was simply being what it was. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed me one last piece of evidence. A video from a wildlife survey drone taken the day after the attack. In it, GB-237 could be seen moving through the high country, already miles away from our encounter. He's returned to his normal patterns, she explained. Bears don't hold grudges or seek revenge like in the movies. To him, it was just another day defending his territory. Something in me understood, even as another part recoiled at the thought of the bear still roaming free. This was his home, had been his home long before humans started coming with their fishing rods and cameras. The fact that he could kill us was precisely why we found these places so compelling. They reminded us that we weren't always at the top of the food chain. The story will fade, Sarah said gently, gathering her materials. By next season, it'll just be another warning tale shared around campfires. But GB-237 will still be up there, doing what bears do. It's what makes places like Glacier so special, even if sometimes that wildness comes with a price. As she left, I found myself staring out the window toward the mountains, knowing that somewhere up there, a massive grizzly was going about his day, neither good nor evil, simply wild. The thought was somehow both terrifying and comforting, a reminder that despite all our attempts to control and understand nature, there were still places where we were simply guests, and not always welcome ones. The photos and reports would be filed away, the incident recorded in park statistics, but GB-237 would remain. a living embodiment of the wilderness that both drew and frightened us. And I would carry the proof of that wildness forever, etched into my flesh and burned into my memory. Extend and flex your fingers for me, Mr. Hunt. Lisa, my physical therapist, instructed. Good. Now try to make a fist. 3 months had passed since the attack, and I was deep into the grueling routine of rehabilitation. The fluorescent lights of the therapy center cast harsh shadows across the scars that now decorated my left arm, thick rope lines that told the story of GB 237's claws in permanent ink on my skin. The range of motion is improving, Lisa noted, making marks on her clipboard. How's the nerve pain? Still feels like electricity sometimes, I admitted, watching my fingers trembled as I tried to close them, especially in the morning or when it's cold. That's normal for this type of injury. The nerves are still regenerating. She moved my arm through various positions, testing flexibility and strength.
Any nightmares this week?
The question was casual, but I tensed involuntarily. Physical therapy wasn't just about rebuilding muscle and mobility. It was about processing trauma too. Same as usual, I muttered. The sound of breaking branches, the feel of hot breath, the terrible weight. Lisa nodded sympathetically. Have you considered Dr. Patterson's suggestion about EMDR therapy? I'm fine, I said automatically, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. The nightmares came regularly, the sound of breaking branches, the feel of hot breath, the weight pressing down. I'd wake up gasping, my left arm burning with phantom pain, the sheets soaked with sweat. Your friends and family have been pushing you to take legal action against the Park Service, Lisa commented as she helped me with resistance exercises. It wasn't a question. Small towns had a way of spreading news. Wouldn't do any good. I grimaced as I attempted to lift a 2-pound weight. Sarah and her team did everything by the book. Sometimes nature just... I paused, remembering Sarah's words from the hospital. Reminds us who's really in charge up there. The recovery process had become my new routine. 3 times a week, I drive to the rehabilitation center in Kalispell, working to rebuild strength in my damaged arm while the scars slowly faded from angry red to pale pink. The other days were filled with occupational therapy, learning to adapt to my new limitations. You're making excellent progress, Lisa assured me, helping me wipe down the equipment. Most bear attack survivors take much longer to regain this level of function. Bear attack survivor. The term still felt strange, like it belonged to someone else. Sometimes I'd catch people staring at my scars in the grocery store or at the gas station, and I could see the questions in their eyes. But the story had faded from local memory, becoming just another tale told around campfires to warn careless hikers. That evening, I sat on my back porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. My left arm ached from therapy, a constant reminder of that morning by the creek. I flexed my fingers slowly, feeling the now familiar pull of scar tissue. My phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. GB 237 spotted near Logan Pass. Healthy and active. Thought you'd want to know. I stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to feel. The bear had become something of a mythical figure in my mind, both real and unreal, like a character from a story I couldn't quite believe I'd been part of. The doorbell rang, startling me from my thoughts. It was Mike, my neighbor, holding a 6-pack of beer. Thought you might want some company, he said, settling into the other porch chair. Rough day at PT? I nodded, accepting a beer. Lisa says I'm making progress, but sometimes it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You're lucky to be alive, Mike said, not for the first time. Should have sued the Park Service, if you ask me. They knew that bear was in the area. The bear was doing what bears do, I replied, repeating the words I'd said countless times before. I was in his territory. Besides, what would a lawsuit prove? Can't exactly put GB 237 on the witness stand. Mike shook his head, unconvinced. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge above the mountains. Finally, he asked the question I could tell had been on his mind. You ever going back out there? Fishing. I took a long pull from my beer, considering. The truth was, I didn't know. The mountains still called to me, but now their voice carried a different tone. Less invitation, more warning. The wilderness had shown me its teeth, literally, and that knowledge couldn't be unlearned. Maybe, I said finally, but not this season. Not yet. Later that night, as I got ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The scars told their story in raised lines across my skin. Here's where the first claw struck. Here's where the weight crushed me. Here's where survival became the only thing that mattered. The nightmares came as they always did, but they were changing, evolving. Sometimes now, instead of pure terror, there was something else in them, a strange respect for the power and indifference of nature, a recognition that what had felt like malice was simply wildness expressing itself in the only way it knew how. I knew the physical therapy would continue, the scars would fade, and life would go on. The story would become just another anecdote, a reminder that despite all our pretensions of control, we still shared this world with creatures that didn't play by our rules. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about GB-237, probably denning down for the night somewhere in his mountain kingdom. He'd survived our encounter too, carrying on with his bare life, neither good nor evil, simply wild. And maybe that was the hardest lesson of recovery, accepting that some experiences change us forever, and the best we can do is adapt, heal, and carry their teachings forward, even if those teachings come with scars. 6 months after the attack, I found myself pulling into the same parking lot where my morning of fishing had turned into a nightmare. The dashboard clock read 5:17 a.m., exactly the same time as that day. The coincidence made my stomach clench. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said from the passenger seat. She'd agreed to accompany me on this first return visit, though I could tell she had reservations. "No one would think less of you for waiting longer." I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my left hand still slightly weaker than my right. "I do have to do this. If I don't come back now, I never will." The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around my truck like a shroud. Through the windshield, I could see thin wisps of fog dancing across the pavement, just like that morning. Everything was the same, yet everything was different. "At least let me call in your location," Sarah said, reaching for her radio. "Standard protocol for bear attack survivors returning to the scene?" I finished with a bitter laugh. "How many of those do you get?" "More than you'd think," she replied quietly, "though most wait longer than 6 months." I checked my gear methodically, but this time it wasn't fishing equipment I was inventorying. Bear spray, 2 cans, not 1. Air horn, satellite phone, heavy-duty flashlight. The physical weight of the precautions matched the emotional weight of the moment. As we stepped out of the truck, the crisp mountain air bit at my face, carrying the same September chill. I found myself scanning the tree line compulsively, my body tensed for any sound of breaking branches. "The trail's been improved," Sarah commented as we started walking. "We added more clearing on the sides, better visibility." But I barely heard her. Every step down the path sent echoes of memory through my mind, the sound of my gear rattling, the peaceful anticipation of a morning's fishing, the false sense of security that had preceded the attack. When we reached the bend in the creek where it had happened, I stopped dead in my tracks. The location was unmistakable, though nature had long since erased any physical evidence of the encounter. The spring runoff had washed the rocks clean of bloodstains, and new vegetation had grown over the torn earth where GB-237 had charged. "You okay?" Sarah asked, her hand hovering near her bear spray. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The river flowed on, unchanged, uncaring about the drama that had played out on its banks. The morning sun was starting to paint the sky in familiar shades of pink and orange, just as it had done that day. Taking out my binoculars, I scanned the opposite shore. Fresh bear signs were immediately apparent, claw marks on trees, scattered berry bushes stripped clean, tracks in the mud near the water's edge. "He's still active in the area," Sarah confirmed, following my gaze. "GB-237 maintains this as part of his territory. We've had multiple trail cam captures over the winter and spring." My hand unconsciously went to my left arm, feeling the ridges of scars through my jacket sleeve. Does he look healthy? Very. The attack didn't change his behavior patterns at all. If anything, he's more established in this territory now. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. Birds began their dawn chorus, and somewhere upstream, a fish jumped with a distant splash. The scene was peaceful, perfect, and terrifying. As the light grew stronger, I thought I saw movement through my binoculars, a flash of brown fur among the trees on the far bank. My heart rate spiked and I felt my chest tighten. "Sarah," I whispered, pointing. She raised her own binoculars. "Yes, I see him, about 200 yards upstream, moving parallel to the water." Through the lenses, I watched the massive shape move with fluid grace through the undergrowth. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking GB-237's size and powerful presence. He moved with purpose, patrolling his domain just as he had that morning 6 months ago. "We should head back," Sarah suggested quietly. "He's moving this way, and you've proven what you came to prove." She was right. I'd needed to face this place again, to see with my own eyes that it was just a location, not the haunted ground my nightmares had made it. And I'd needed to see him, not the monster of my memories, but the wild creature he actually was, going about his bear business in his bear world. As we turned to leave, I took one last look at the creek. The fishing spot that had once been my sanctuary was now forever changed, marked by memories as surely as my arm was marked by scars. But something else had changed too. The paralyzing fear that had gripped me for months was beginning to transform into something more complex, more nuanced. "You know," I said as we walked back to the truck, my voice steadier than I'd expected, "I always thought this place belonged to us, the fishermen, the hikers, the tourists. But it doesn't, does it?" Sarah shook her head. "We're guests here. Sometimes we forget that, and nature has to remind us." "Hell of a reminder," I muttered, but without bitterness. Back at the parking lot, I stored my unused gear in the truck and took one final look at the mountains. The sun had fully risen now, illuminating the landscape in crisp detail. Somewhere up there, GB-237 was continuing his morning patrol, neither concerned with nor changed by our brief observation of him. This time, I turned back, knowing some memories are better left undisturbed. The wilderness had taught me its lesson, and I had finally learned to listen. The mountains would always be here, and so would the bears. It was up to us to learn how to be better guests in their domain. Years have passed since that morning by McDonald Creek, but I carry the memory with me like a stone in my pocket. Always there, its weight familiar now, almost comfortable. The scars on my left arm have faded to silvery lines that web across my skin, telling their story in braille-like ridges that my fingers trace during quiet moments. "Grandpa, tell us about the bear again," my 7-year-old grandson Tommy begs during a family camping trip, safely distant from Glacier in the managed confines of a state park. "Tommy," my daughter Karen scolds, shooting me an apologetic look. "Dad doesn't want to." "It's okay," I assure her, settling into my camp chair by the fire. The flames cast flickering shadows that no longer make me flinch. "But first, Tommy, what's the most important thing to remember about bears?" "They're not bad guys," he answers promptly. "They're just being bears." I smile, remembering how long it took me to learn that simple truth. That's right. And this particular bear, GB-237, was just doing what bears do. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I can almost smell the morning mist off McDonald Creek, mixed with the musky scent of bear. The memories come in sensory snapshots now. The sound of rushing water, the weight of my fishing rod, the moment of perfect peace before chaos erupted. Last week, Sarah Martinez, now retired from the Park Service, sent me her final update about GB-237. The email was brief but meaningful. DNA testing from scat samples confirms GB-237 is still actively patrolling his territory. Trail cams caught him teaching 2 cubs to fish this spring. Thought you'd want to know. Your bear is a father now. Sarah, your bear. The phrase made me laugh, but there was truth in it. We were connected now, GB-237 and I, linked by a moment of violence that had changed me forever while being just another day in his wild life. Does it still hurt, Grandpa? Tommy asks, pointing to my arm. Only when it rains. I tell him, though that's not entirely true. Physical therapy and time have healed most of the damage, but there are deeper marks that weather can't touch. Karen watches me carefully, the way she has since that morning when the hospital called her. You never did go back to fishing, she observes quietly after Tommy runs off to chase fireflies. No, I agree, stoking the campfire, but not because of fear, not anymore. It's more like respect. The wilderness taught me something that day, and part of the lesson was knowing when and where I belong. The Park Service eventually confirmed through DNA testing that my bear still roams those woods, following the ancient rhythms of the seasons. Trail cameras occasionally capture him, massive and proud, teaching his cubs the ways of their world. He's grown older, like me, but no less wild, no less himself. Do you regret it? My wife Mary asks later that night, as we lie in our tent listening to the familiar sounds of a forest at night. Going fishing that morning? I consider the question carefully. The attack changed everything, my relationship with nature, my understanding of my place in the world, even my daily routines. But it also taught me something profound about survival, about resilience, and about the raw, uncompromising honesty of the wild. No, I finally answer. It was terrible and beautiful and real. How many people get to experience something that pure, that true? I've learned to live with the knowledge that somewhere in Glacier National Park, a massive grizzly continues his patrols. Neither good nor evil, simply wild. The mountains still call to me, but now I hear their voice differently, not as an invitation to conquer or possess, but as a reminder of my place in a world far bigger and more untamed than we like to pretend. The next morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in familiar shades of pink and orange, I roll up my sleeve and look at the scars. They tell a story of survival, yes, but also of connection. A moment when the civilized world fell away and I was forced to confront nature on its own terms. Tommy joins me, his eyes wide as he traces one of the longer scars with a gentle finger. Were you scared, Grandpa? Terrified, I admit. But you know what I learned? Being scared doesn't make you weak. It makes you pay attention. And sometimes, paying attention is what keeps you alive. In the end, I was just another chapter in GB 237's story, while he became the defining chapter in mine. The newspapers may have forgotten. The incident report may be gathering dust in some Park Service filing cabinet, but the truth of that morning lives on in my scars, in my memories, and in the way I now move through wild places not with fear, but with awareness, respect, and a deep understanding that we are all, in our own ways, simply trying to survive in a world we never fully control. Look, Tommy whispers, pointing to where a deer has emerged from the tree line. Do we need to be scared? I shake my head, watching the deer pause at the edge of our campsite. No, buddy. We just need to remember that we're guests here. This is their home. We're just passing through. The deer moves on, disappearing into the forest like a ghost. Tommy's hand finds mine, warm and trusting, as the sun climbs higher into the morning sky. Somewhere far to the north, in the shadows of Glacier's peaks, I know GB237 is probably teaching his cubs the same lesson he taught me, that the wilderness belongs to itself, and we are all, in the end, just stories it tells to itself in the language of tooth and claw, blood and survival, fear and acceptance. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get to carry those stories with us, marked in our flesh and burned into our memories, reminding us forever of who we really are and where we truly belong. The late September sun was already low in the sky when I turned onto the unmarked dirt road leading to Glacier Peak's remote campsites. My pickup truck bounced over the rutted path, camping gear rattling in the bed behind me. The forest pressed in close on both sides, creating a tunnel of golden-tinged pine needles that scattered light across my windshield. I'd chosen this particular weekend for its promise of solitude. Most tourists had already cleared out for the season, leaving the wilderness to more serious outdoorsmen like myself, or so I thought. The irony of that assumption still makes me wince. The ranger station was a small log cabin with peeling green trim, looking exactly like it had in the photos online. A weathered sign reading Glacier Peak Wilderness, permit required, creaked gently in the autumn breeze. As I stepped out of my truck, the sharp scent of pine sap and wet earth filled my lungs. Rangers usually made these check-ins quick and routine, but Sarah Whitaker, the young ranger behind the desk, seemed distracted as she processed my permit. "You'll be at Site 14?" she asked, glancing up from her computer. "That's pretty far out there. When was the last time you camped in grizzly country?" I adjusted my pack, trying to project confidence. "It's been a few years, but I've got all the essentials. Bear spray, bear-proof container for food, the works." Sarah's pen tapped against the desk. "We've had increased activity in that area over the past week. Nothing aggressive, but there's a big male that's been marking territory near those sites." "Thanks for the heads up," I said, already thinking about the perfect photos I could get if I spotted him from a safe distance. "I'll be extra careful with food storage." She nodded, but her expression remained serious. "Make sure you do. And take this." She handed me a freshly printed warning notice. "We're requiring all campers to carry these now. It has emergency numbers and proper bear encounter protocols." I folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket, where it would later be shredded along with my jacket. "Anything else I should know?" "Just keep your bear spray close, not in your pack on your belt, even in camp." She stamped my permit with perhaps more force than necessary. "And if you smell anything unusual, anything at all, please report it immediately." I remember thinking she was being overcautious, maybe even trying to scare the tourist. The wisdom of her words wouldn't hit me until much later. The drive to Site 14 took another 20 minutes, the road deteriorating with each mile. When I finally pulled into the small clearing that would serve as my campsite, the shadows had grown long and sharp. The site was perfect, a flat area for my tent, a designated fire pit, and an old picnic table. Dense forest surrounded three sides, while the fourth offered a stunning view of the valley below. As I started unloading my gear, the first hint of something wrong tickled my nose. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable beneath the forest's natural perfume. But as I moved around the site, it became more distinct, a sickly sweet odor with undertones of decay. "Probably just something dead in the woods," I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the way the smell made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Later, I would learn that the stench came from a partially eaten elk carcass, the grizzly's latest kill, hidden less than a quarter-mile from my campsite. Setting up camp took longer than expected, and dusk was settling in by the time I had my tent secured. The temperature dropped quickly as the sun disappeared, and I pulled on an extra layer before starting to prepare dinner. The freeze-dried meal instructions specifically recommended cooking away from the campsite, but the growing darkness made me reluctant to wander too far. Instead, I compromised by using my portable stove at the picnic table, planning to store all food in the bear container well away from my tent afterward. That's when I heard a deep, huffing sound carried on the evening breeze. I froze, the foil packet of rehydrated stroganoff halfway to my mouth. Several seconds passed in complete silence before a soft rustle of leaves made me whip around, heart pounding. Nothing, just shadows dancing in the beam of my headlamp. "Get it together," I chided myself. "Your imagination's working overtime." Still, I rushed through the rest of my dinner prep and cleanup, making sure to carefully pack away anything with a scent into the bear container. I placed it a good 100 yards from my campsite, just as recommended. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, exhaustion had mostly overcome my earlier unease. The night passed fitfully, filled with half-remembered dreams of movement in the darkness and that huffing sound that might have been the wind. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the crisp morning air, eager to start my planned hike. That's when I saw the massive paw prints pressed deep into the mud near my bear container. They were fresh, the edges still sharp and clear, water slowly seeping into the deepest parts. Each print was bigger than my spread hand, with clear claw marks extended beyond the toe pads. My mouth went dry as I remembered Ranger Sarah's warning about the male grizzly marking his territory. Looking at those tracks, at the casual display of power they represented, I finally understood just how vulnerable I was. But by then, it was already too late. The bear was watching me from the tree line, and my real nightmare was about to begin. The morning mist clung to the ground in thick, twisting ropes, making the forest look alien and unfamiliar. I stood frozen by my tent, the half-eaten granola bar in my hand completely forgotten, as I stared at the massive shape moving through the fog about 200 yards away. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a shadow, a trick of the light playing through the trees. Then it moved again, and there was no mistaking what I was seeing. The grizzly bear emerged from the mist like something from a primordial nightmare. Even at this distance, I could tell it was enormous, easily over 700 pounds, its brown fur appearing almost black in the early morning light. But it was the bear's eyes that stopped my breath completely, fixed directly on me with an intensity that made my knees weak. "Oh God!" I whispered, the words barely audible even to myself. "Oh God! Oh God!" My mind raced through the bear safety briefing I'd received just yesterday. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Speak in a calm, firm voice. All those instructions seemed absurd now, faced with this mountain of muscle and claws that was regarding me with such focused interest. The bear's head swayed slightly from side to side as it walked, a movement I'd later learn was typical of grizzlies assessing a potential threat or prey. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the granola bar as I so slowly, reached for the bear spray canister on my belt. "Hey bear!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady and authoritative. Came out as more of a croak. "Hey there, big guy. I see you." The grizzly's ears twitched at the sound of my voice, but it continued its deliberate approach. Each step it took seemed to last an eternity, its massive paws moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. The morning dew dripped from its fur, catching the early light like tiny diamonds. My fingers finally closed around the bear spray, the cold metal of the canister offering little comfort. I'd practiced drawing it dozens of times before this trip, but now the simple action felt clumsy and foreign. "I'm just going to back away slowly," I announced, more to steady myself than to actually communicate with the bear. "No threat here, just giving you your space." I took one careful step backward, then another. The grizzly stopped its advance, lifting its head to better scent the air. Its nose twitched, and I suddenly remembered with horror the half-eaten granola bar still clutched in my left hand. With agonizing slowness, I lowered my arm and let the food drop to the ground. The bear's reaction was immediate. Its head lowered, and a deep, rumbling sound reached me across the clearing. Not quite a growl, but a clear warning that made every primitive instinct in my body scream to run. "Easy," I said, my voice cracking. "Easy now." That's when I made my first mistake. As I continued backing away, my heel caught on an exposed root. I stumbled slightly, dropping my eyes from the bear for just a fraction of a second to regain my balance. When I looked up again, the grizzly was charging. The sight of 700 pounds of muscle and fury bearing down on you at 30 miles per hour is something no amount of training can prepare you for. The bear covered 50 yards in what seemed like milliseconds, its paws throwing up divots of earth, its breath coming in deep huffs that seemed to shake the very air. I raised the bear spray with trembling hands, my thumb finding the safety clip just as Ranger Sarah had shown me. But before I could depress the trigger, the bear suddenly veered off, turning so sharply it left deep gouges in the earth less than 20 feet from where I stood. A bluff charge. My knees finally gave out, and I collapsed to the ground, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. The grizzly had stopped at the edge of the clearing, turning to face me again with what I could have sworn was an almost contemplative expression. "Jesus Christ," I gasped, still gripping the bear spray so tightly my knuckles had gone white. "Jesus Christ." The bear huffed again, this time with what sounded almost like irritation. It took a few steps toward me, and I scrambled backward on my hands and feet, all thoughts of proper bear behavior forgotten in my panic. "Please," I whispered. "Please no." For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we remained in this tableau on the ground, the bear watching me with those terrifyingly intelligent eyes. Finally, it turned away, moving back toward the tree line with the same fluid grace it had shown in its charge. But something in its departure felt wrong. There was no sense of retreat, no suggestion that it was leaving out of fear or submission. Instead, the bear moved like something that was simply choosing to delay an inevitable confrontation. Before disappearing into the mist, it turned its head to look at me one final time, and in that moment, I knew with bone-deep certainty that this wasn't over. I stayed on the ground long after the bear had vanished, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my clothes soaked with dew and cold sweat. When I finally found the strength to stand, my legs were shaking so badly I had to lean against a tree for support. I should have left then, should have packed up my camp and driven straight back to civilization. But I didn't. Whether it was shock, stubborn pride, or simple disbelief in what had just happened, I convinced myself the worst was over. Couldn't have been more wrong. The real horror was still to come. After the bluff charge, I spent the next hour in a daze, mechanically packing my campsite while constantly scanning the tree line. The rational part of my brain kept insisting the bear was gone, that I should just finish packing and hike back to my truck. But something more primitive, something buried deep in my ancestral memory, knew better. I was rolling up my sleeping bag when I heard it, the snap of a branch behind me, too heavy to be anything but the bear. I turned slowly, desperately hoping I was wrong. I wasn't. The grizzly stood at the edge of my campsite, closer than before, its muscles rippling beneath its thick fur as it moved. This time, there was no hesitation in its approach, no cautious assessment. Its eyes held mine with predatory focus, and its lips pulled back to reveal yellowed teeth. Everything I knew about bear safety evaporated in that moment. Every instruction, every careful protocol gone. Raw instinct took over and I ran. I heard myself screaming, "No!" as I bolted into the forest, my feet carrying me away from the campsite before my mind could process what was happening. Behind me came the sound of splintering wood as the bear crashed through the underbrush in pursuit, its massive body demolishing everything in its path. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew there was no one within miles to hear. "Somebody help!" The forest became a blur of green and brown as I sprinted uphill, remembering through my panic that the ranger station lay somewhere in this direction. Branches whipped across my face, leaving stinging welts. My lungs burned with each desperate breath, the thin mountain air providing barely enough oxygen to keep me moving. The bear's huffing breath seemed to fill the entire forest, getting closer with each passing second. The rhythmic thud of its paws hitting the ground sent vibrations through the earth that I could feel in my bones. 700 pounds of apex predator was bearing down on me, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. "Please," I gasped, though I wasn't sure who or what I was begging. "Please, please." My foot caught a root, and I stumbled but somehow kept my balance. The momentary slowdown was enough to hear the bear's breathing get even closer. It was toying with me, I realized with horror. Could have caught me already if it wanted to. Through the trees ahead, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a maintenance trail wider and clearer than the forest floor I was currently navigating. If I could reach it, maybe I could make better time. Maybe I could. The sound of a tree branch snapping like a gunshot came from much too close behind me. Against every survival instinct, I looked back. That was my final mistake. The bear was less than 30 feet behind me, moving with terrible purpose, its eyes locked on my fleeing form. The sight of it in full pursuit was so terrifying that I lost focus on where I was putting my feet. My boot came down on a patch of wet leaves, and suddenly the world tilted sideways. I hit the ground hard and began tumbling down a short embankment I hadn't even seen. The world spun in a kaleidoscope of earth and sky as I rolled, unable to stop my descent. Rocks and branches battered my body as I fell, each impact driving the air from my lungs. "No, no, no." I tried to scream, but it came out as more of a wheeze. I came to a stop at the bottom of the embankment, dazed and gasping for breath. Somewhere above me, I could hear the bear crashing down the slope, taking a more controlled route to its prey. I tried to push myself up, to continue running, but my body wouldn't respond quickly enough. Through blurry vision, I saw the grizzly reach the bottom of the embankment. I paused for a moment, as if making sure I wasn't going anywhere, then began its final approach. There was no hurry in its movements now, no need to rush. It had run me to ground, just as its ancestors had done to prey for millions of years. I made one last attempt to stand, to face my death on my feet at least, but my legs gave out beneath me. The best I could manage was to push myself backward with my hands and feet, crab walking away from the approaching bear. Someone, I tried to call out, but my voice was barely a whisper now. Anyone. The bear closed the distance between us with deliberate steps. I could see every detail of it now, the mud caked in its fur from the chase, the steam rising from its mouth in the cool morning air, the way its claws dug into the earth with each step. This close, it seemed impossibly huge, a force of nature made flesh. My back hit a tree trunk. Nowhere left to go. The bear was less than 10 feet away now, and I could smell its wild, musky scent mixed with something metallic that I realized must be blood from a recent kill. As the massive predator reared up on its hind legs, I had time for one final, crystal-clear thought. I should have listened to Ranger Sarah. Then the bear dropped to all fours and charged, and the real nightmare began. The impact came without warning. One moment I was pressed against the tree trunk, the next I was airborne, lifted and thrown by a force that felt more like a vehicle collision than a living creature. All the air exploded from my lungs as I hit the ground hard enough to see stars. I barely had time to gasp before a massive weight crashed down on my back, driving me face first into the forest floor. Hot breath and saliva dripped onto my neck as the bear's jaws clamped down on my backpack. The sound of tearing fabric filled my ears, mixed with deep, rumbling growls that vibrated through my entire body. "Oh God, please," I choked out, mouth full of dirt and leaves. "Please no." The bear shook me violently, and I felt something in my right shoulder give way with a sickening pop. White-hot pain shot through my arm as the joint dislocated. I screamed then, a raw animal sound I didn't know I was capable of making. The backpack straps dug into my chest and shoulders as the grizzly treated me like a rag doll in the jaws of a dog. My mind kept cycling through the bear attack protocols I'd memorized. Play dead for grizzlies. Fight back for black bears. Play dead for grizzlies. But as the bear's claws raked through my jacket and into the flesh of my back, sending fresh waves of agony through my body, all thoughts of proper procedure vanished. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew it was useless. "Somebody help me!" The bear released its grip on my backpack suddenly, and for a fraction of a second, I felt a surge of hope. Then massive paws flipped me over like I weighed nothing at all, and I found myself staring directly into the grizzly's face. Time seemed to slow down as I took in every terrifying detail. Its eyes were a deep amber color, intelligent and focused. Strings of saliva hung from yellowed teeth the size of my fingers. The fur around its muzzle was matted with what looked like old blood. Its breath smelled like rotting meat and wet fur, hot against my face as it huffed and snorted. I tried to curl into a protective ball, to shield my vital organs as the survival guides recommended, but my dislocated shoulder made movement almost impossible. The bear's claws caught my chest as I tried to turn, tearing through my jacket and flesh with horrifying ease. I felt warm blood immediately begin to soak my shirt. The roar that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not the sound effects from movies or even the warning growls from earlier. This was primordial, a sound that bypassed all higher brain functions and went straight to the deepest part of my primitive brain. The vibration of it made my teeth rattle in my skull, and I could feel it in my chest cavity. "Please," I whimpered, all pretense of bravery gone. "Please don't." The bear's paw came down on my chest, pinning me to the ground. Each breath became a struggle as its weight pressed down on my ribcage. I could feel its claws puncturing my skin even through what remained of my jacket. The grizzly's head lowered toward my face, and I was certain these were my final moments. My vision started to narrow, black edges creeping in as panic and pain threatened to overwhelm me. The bear's face filled my entire field of view, its hot breath washing over me in waves. I could see my own terrified reflection in its dark eyes. A distant part of my mind noted that the attack had probably only lasted seconds, but each moment stretched into an eternity of pain and terror. The weight on my chest increased as the bear shifted its position, and I heard the distinct sound of ribs creaking under pressure. Blood from the claw wounds on my chest was pooling beneath me, warm against my back in stark contrast to the cool earth. The coppery smell of it seemed to excite T. He bare further, its growls taking on a different pitch. I was about to black out when survival instinct kicked in one final time. My left hand, pinned awkwardly beneath my torn backpack, brushed against something cylindrical. The bear spray. It had somehow stayed attached to my belt during the initial attack. With every ounce of strength I had left, I twisted my wrist to grip the canister. The movement sent fresh waves of agony through my dislocated shoulder, but adrenaline helped me push through it. The bear's jaws were opening wide, moving toward my face or throat, when I managed to free the spray from its holster. My thumb found the safety clip just as the grizzly's teeth brushed my neck. I had one chance, one final moment to act before those massive jaws closed on my throat. Time seemed to freeze as I brought the canister up between us. The bear's eyes met mine one final time, and in that moment, I saw something that haunts me still, not mindless aggression or simple predatory instinct, but something closer to focused intention. This wasn't just an attack of opportunity. The grizzly had chosen this confrontation. Then its jaws began to close and I squeezed the trigger. What happened next would change everything. But in that moment, pinned beneath hundreds of pounds of apex predator, all I could think was how strange it was that the bear's fur looked almost golden in the morning light streaming through the trees above us. That's the last clear memory I have before the real pain began. Time crystallized into perfect clarity as I stared into the bear's face, close enough to count every scar on its muzzle. The world had narrowed to just this. Amber eyes locked with mine, yellowish teeth inches from my throat, and the weight of certain death pressing down on my chest. I squeezed the trigger of the bear spray. The effect was instantaneous. A bright orange cloud erupted between us, catching the grizzly full in the face. The capsaicin hit its eyes, nose, and mouth simultaneously, and the reaction was explosive. The bear reared back with a roar that was more scream than growl, pawing frantically at its face. But in its panic and pain, those massive claws raked across my chest one final time, tearing deep furrows through skin and muscle. Fresh blood sprayed across my face, hot and metallic. I screamed, the sound barely human, more animal than anything I'd ever produced before. "Get back!" I screamed hoarsely, continuing to spray in wide arcs as I scrambled backward on my elbows. "Get back!" The bear thrashed violently, snorting and wheezing as it tried to clear the burning spray from its airways. Its movements were chaotic now, all previous predatory grace replaced by blind panic. Each swipe of its massive paws sent leaves and dirt flying through the orange mist that hung in the air between us. I could feel the spray affecting me to my eyes burning, my throat on fire. Each breath felt like inhaling flames. They warn you about the blowback in bear spray training, but nothing prepares you for the reality of it. "Please work." I wheezed through the burning in my throat. Please work." The grizzly stumbled sideways, crashing into a young pine tree hard enough to snap it. The sound of splintering wood mixed with its pained roars echoed through the forest. Its eyes were squeezed shut, thick tears streaming down its face as its body tried desperately to flush out the irritant. I kept backing away, leaving a trail of blood on the forest floor, my dislocated shoulder sending waves of agony through my body with each movement. The bear spray can was nearly empty now, but I didn't dare lower it. Through the haze of pepper spray, I could still make out the massive shape of the bear, though my vision was beginning to blur. "Stay back," I croaked, though I doubt the bear could hear anything over its own distress. "Just stay back." Blood loss and pain were starting to take their toll. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision, and a curious numbness began spreading through my limbs. I knew I was going into shock, but there was nothing I could do about it. The bear was still between me and any hope of escape. The grizzly had stopped its violent thrashing but was still pawing at its face, huffing and snorting continuously. Each breath it took seemed to cause it fresh agony as the capsaicin burned its sensitive nasal passages. Its movements were becoming more focused though, less panicked, and that terrified me more than its earlier rage. No, 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 I muttered as I saw its head begin to turn in my direction. Please no. Through swollen eyes, the bear managed to focus on me again. Even half-blind and in obvious pain, it moved with terrible purpose. One step forward, then another. The bear spray had hurt it, yes, but it hadn't stopped it. Not completely. I raised the nearly empty can one final time, my hand shaking so badly I could barely aim. Stay back. My voice cracked with fear and exhaustion. I swear to God. The bear took another step forward, then suddenly stopped. It shook its massive head, sending drops of blood, saliva, and tears flying through the air. The pepper spray was still working, still burning, still making every breath an agony. For a long moment, the grizzly stood there, swaying slightly, as if weighing its options. Then, incredibly, it began to back away. One step at first, then another. Its movements were unsteady, almost drunk-looking, but the retreat was unmistakable. Through my blurring vision, I watched as the massive predator turned away from me, still huffing and snorting, and began to move toward the denser forest. "Oh God," I whispered, not daring to believe it was really over. "Oh, thank God." But even as relief flooded through me, my body was reaching its limits. The adrenaline that had kept me going was fading fast, replaced by waves of pain and a bone-deep coldness that had nothing to do with the morning air. I could feel blood flowing freely from the claw wounds on my chest and back, soaking what remained of my shredded clothing. As my vision continued to darken around the edges, I watched the bear's massive form disappear into the forest, still occasionally shaking its head and pawing at its face. The last thing I remember before unconsciousness took me was the sound of breaking branches growing fainter as the grizzly moved away, leaving me alone with my injuries and the burning aftermath of the pepper spray. The bear spray had saved my life, but as I lay there in the blood-soaked leaves, struggling to remain conscious, I knew the fight for survival wasn't over yet. The forest was still full of dangers. I was badly injured, and help was miles away. If I wanted to live to tell the story, I would have to find the strength to move. But for now, all I could do was lie there, breathing in the burning air, and listen to the retreating sounds of the bear that had nearly killed me. The real struggle was just beginning. Consciousness returned slowly, in waves of pain and confusion. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The forest had gone completely quiet, as if holding its breath. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, nothing but my own ragged breathing and the slow drip of blood onto fallen leaves. The grizzly was gone, but evidence of its attack was everywhere. My backpack lay in shreds several yards away, its contents scattered across the forest floor. Strips of my torn jacket fluttered in the gentle breeze, dark with blood. The acrid smell of pepper spray still hung in the air, making my eyes water and my throat burn with each breath. Have to move, I mumbled through cracked lips, trying to focus my thoughts. The first attempt to sit up sent daggers of pain through my chest and back. I gasped, the sound embarrassingly close to a sob, and fell back against the bloody leaves. Every movement caused the deep claw wounds to pull and tear, sending fresh trickles of warm blood down my skin. "Come on," I whispered to myself. "Come on, you have to move." My right shoulder was a special kind of agony, the dislocated joint completely useless. Each tiny movement sent waves of nausea through my body, but it was the wounds on my chest that worried me most. I could feel them pulling apart with every breath, could see the dark blood still seeping through what remained of my shirt. With my left hand, I carefully probed the injuries on my chest. The bear's claws had left 4 deep parallel gashes, each about 8 inches long. They weren't spurting blood, no arteries hit, thank God, but they were deep enough to need immediate attention. "Okay," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "Okay, first aid. You know first aid." I looked around at the scattered contents of my backpack, trying to spot my first aid kit through increasingly blurry vision. There, a flash of white plastic about 15 feet away. It might as well have been a mile. The journey to reach the first aid kit was a nightmare of pain and determination. I couldn't stand, couldn't even crawl properly with my dislocated shoulder. Instead, I had to drag myself across the ground using my left arm and legs, leaving a trail of blood on the leaves and dirt. Just a little further, I grunted, fighting waves of dizziness. When I finally reached the kit, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely open it. The contents spilled across the ground. Gauze, bandages, antiseptic wipes, medical tape, basic supplies that suddenly seemed hopelessly inadequate for the severity of my injuries. I tried to remember my wilderness first aid training through the fog of shock and blood loss. Stop the bleeding first. Clean the wounds if possible. Bandage securely. Using my teeth and left hand, I managed to tear open several packets of gauze. The antiseptic wipes made me hiss in pain as I cleaned what I could reach of the claw wounds. But I knew infection would be deadly out here. "This is gonna suck," I muttered, pressing fresh gauze against the chest wounds. The pressure made me cry out, the sound echoing through the silent forest. But I held the gauze firm, knowing I had to stop the bleeding. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I felt the blood flow beginning to slow. Now came the hard part. Using strips torn from what remained of my jacket, I tried to create a makeshift pressure bandage to hold the gauze in place. It was almost impossible with one hand, and I had to use my teeth more than once, but eventually I managed to secure the wounds. The gashes on my back were another matter entirely. I couldn't reach them properly, couldn't see how bad they were. The best I could do was press more gauze against them and hope the pressure of lying on my back would help slow the bleeding. Focus, I told myself as another wave of dizziness hit. You have to focus. The forest remained eerily quiet, as if the bear's attack had scared away every living thing for miles. Or maybe they were still there, watching, waiting to see if I would become carrion. The thought made me shudder. I checked my watch, surprised to find only 30 minutes had passed since the attack. Felt like days. The morning sun had risen higher, sending shafts of light through the trees to illuminate the scene of devastation around me. The bear spray canister lay empty nearby, a reminder of how close it had been. Without it, I pushed the thought away. No time for what-ifs. I had to concentrate on survival. My phone was somewhere in the scattered debris, probably broken. The satellite emergency beacon I'd bought specifically for this trip was still attached to my shredded backpack. If I could reach it, maybe. A branch snapped somewhere in the forest, and I froze. My heart began racing again, blood pounding in my ears as I listened intently. Was the bear coming back? Had the pepper spray worn off? I couldn't go through another attack. I knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't survive it. Several endless seconds passed before I heard the distinctive sound of small animal movement, probably a squirrel or rabbit returning to the area. The relief made me lightheaded, or maybe that was just the blood loss. Either way, I knew I couldn't stay here. The bear might return, and even if it didn't, I was losing too much blood. I needed medical attention, and soon. The ranger station was miles away, but it was my only hope. I had to move, had to find help. But as I tried once again to sit up, the world began to spin, and the edges of my vision grew dark. The last thought I had before unconsciousness took me again was that the forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if it was holding its breath, waiting to see whether I would live or die. The second time I regained consciousness, the sun had moved significantly in the sky. The cool morning air had given way to the warmth of midday, and flies were beginning to buzz around my blood-soaked bandages. That got me moving faster than anything else could have. "Get up," I commanded myself, my voice rough and unfamiliar. "Get up now." Using my good arm, I managed to brace myself against a nearby tree and slowly, agonizingly, pull myself to my feet. The world tilted dangerously, and I had to lean hard against the trunk to keep from falling. Each breath sent fresh waves of pain through my chest where the bear's claws had torn into me. The first step was the hardest. My legs felt like rubber, and the forest floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. But I knew staying put meant death, from blood loss, from infection, or from the bear's return. I had to reach help. I stumbled to what remained of my campsite, using trees for support and leaving bloody handprints on their bark. Every few steps, I had to stop and fight off waves of dizziness. The makeshift bandages were already soaking through with fresh blood, but I had no more supplies to change them. One step, I muttered to myself. Just one more step. A small stream crossed my path, and I nearly wept with relief at the sight of water. My throat was raw from screaming and the lingering effects of the pepper spray. Carefully, I knelt by the water's edge, using my good arm for balance. The reflection that greeted me in the stream's surface was barely recognizable. My face was covered in dirt and blood, some mine, some the bear's. The front of my shredded shirt was dark with dried blood, and fresh red stains were spreading across the makeshift bandages. I looked like an extra from a horror movie. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, touching my face with trembling fingers. "Jesus!" I cupped water with my left hand, drinking carefully and using some to clean my face. The cold water helped clear my head slightly, enough to think about direction. The park road had to be downstream. All the ranger stations were built near water access. Following the stream became my lifeline. When the dizziness threatened to overwhelm me, I focused on the sound of running water. When pain made me want to stop, I remembered the flies gathering around my wounds. When fear of the bear's return made me want to hide, I thought of infection setting in. "Help!" I tried to call out periodically, but my voice was weak, barely carrying past the sound of the stream. "Someone, please." The sun climbed higher, and sweat began to mix with blood on my skin. The wounds on my chest and back felt like they were on fire, and my dislocated shoulder had become a constant, throbbing agony. Every movement sent fresh spikes of pain through my body. I lost track of time, focused only on putting one foot in front of the other. The stream led me through dense forest, over fallen logs that I had to navigate with excruciating care, and past rocky outcroppings that offered no shade from the increasingly hot sun. At one point, I had to stop and vomit, my body rebelling against the pain and trauma. The action tore at my chest wounds, and I felt warm blood begin to flow freely again. When I straightened up, the world spun so violently I had to sit down or fall down. "Come on," I pleaded with myself, fighting back tears of pain and frustration. "Get up, get up." Hours passed this way, walking, stumbling, resting, walking again. I began to hallucinate slightly from blood loss and dehydration, seeing movement in the trees that wasn't there, hearing voices in the wind. Only the steady sound of the stream kept me oriented. Finally, gloriously, I heard something that wasn't water or wind or my own labored breathing. The distant sound of vehicles on the park road. The noise was faint but unmistakable, the hum of tires on asphalt. "Please," I whispered, not sure who I was talking to. "Please be real." I changed direction, heading toward the sound, though every step away from the stream filled me with anxiety. What if I was imagining it? What if I got lost? What if the bear was waiting somewhere between me and help? But the sound grew stronger, more distinct. I could make out individual vehicles now, the rumble of bigger trucks, the lighter sound of cars. I was close, so close. The trees began to thin, and suddenly I could see it, the park road, bathed in afternoon sunlight. The sight of that strip of asphalt nearly broke me. I stumbled the last few yards, tears cutting tracks through the dirt and dried blood on my face. A pickup truck appeared around the bend, moving slowly. I tried to wave, but my strength was finally giving out. The best I could manage was to stagger forward, my left arm raised weakly. The truck's brake lights came on. I saw the driver's face appear in the side mirror, eyes widening in shock at my appearance. Then my legs gave out, and I collapsed at the side of the road, my blood staining the gravel shoulder. "Oh my God!" I heard a woman's voice call out. "Bob, call 911. This man's hurt bad." Footsteps approached rapidly, and I felt gentle hands on my left shoulder. A face swam into view, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair. "Hang on, honey," she said, her voice seeming to come from very far away. "Help is coming. Just hang on." The last thing I remember before passing out again was the sound of her husband on the phone with emergency services, his voice urgent as he tried to describe our location. I had made it out of the forest. But as consciousness slipped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that part of me was still back there, lying in the blood-soaked leaves, staring into the eyes of the bear. I drifted in and out of consciousness during the ambulance ride, catching fragments of urgent conversation between the paramedics. BP's dropping, multiple deep lacerations, significant blood loss, dislocated right shoulder, possible internal injuries. The emergency room was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices. I remember someone cutting away what remained of my clothes, the sharp sting of an 4 being inserted, and the blessed relief when pain medication finally entered my system. "Can you tell me what happened?" a doctor asked, her face swimming into focus above me. "Grizzly," I managed to croak. "Bear attack, Glacier Peak." Her eyes widened slightly, but her voice remained professionally calm. "Okay, we're going to take good care of you. Can you rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? 8. Maybe 9, I whispered, then lost consciousness again. I woke up properly in a hospital room, the steady beep of monitors replacing the urgent voices. A nurse was checking my vitals, and she smiled when she saw my eyes open. "Welcome back," she said. "You've been in and out for about 12 hours. Do you remember what happened?" The memories flooded back, the bear's eyes, the impact, the terror, the long walk out. I nodded slowly, not trusting my voice. Dr. Sarah Chen, the trauma surgeon, came in shortly after. She had kind eyes and a direct manner that I appreciated as she explained the extent of my injuries. "The bear's claws left 8 deep lacerations on your back, SH, he said, consulting my chart. "For more on your chest. We needed over 100 stitches total. You're lucky. The cuts were deep but missed any major arteries or organs." She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "Your right shoulder was dislocated and there's some tissue damage around the joint. We reduced it while you were under, but you'll need physical therapy. You also have significant bruising across your torso and various minor cuts and abrasions. When can I go home?" My voice was barely a whisper. "We need to monitor you for at least 3 more days, she replied. "The risk of infection is high with animal attacks, especially given how long it took you to reach help. We have you on strong antibiotics, but we need to make sure they're working." As if on cue, a nurse came in to change my bandages. In the bathroom mirror, I caught my first real look at my injuries. The bear's claws had left 4 parallel gashes across my chest, now neatly stitched but angry red and swollen. My entire torso was a canvas of purple and yellow bruises. I couldn't see my back, but from the pain, I knew it was worse. Later that afternoon, 2 rangers from Glacier Peak visited my room. One of them was Sarah Whitaker, the ranger who had warned me about the bear activity. To her credit, she didn't say, "I told you so." "We found your campsite," she said, pulling out a notebook. "Can you tell us exactly what happened?" I recounted the attack as best I could, watching them exchange glances at certain details. "The size you're describing," the male ranger said, "and the behavior. It matches reports we've had of a large male grizzly that's been expanding his territory. He's been increasingly bold around humans, but this is the first actual attack. Will you hunt him down?" I asked, not sure how I felt about the answer either way. Sarah shook her head. "Without any witnesses or clear evidence of predatory intent, and given that you were in his territory, no. We'll post additional warnings and temporarily close that area of the park." But the bear was just being a bear. She was right, I knew. The grizzly hadn't been malicious or evil. It had just been following its instincts in its own territory. I was the intruder, the one who had ignored the warnings. The local paper ran a small story about the attack. "Hiker survives grizzly mauling at Glacier Peak," read the headline, accompanied by a generic stock photo of a bear. The article was brief, just a few paragraphs about increased bear activity in the area and standard safety precautions. By the next day, it had been replaced by stories about local politics and high school sports. Physical therapy started before I even left the hospital. My shoulder was the biggest concern. The combination of the dislocation and the way I'd had to use it during my escape had done significant damage. This is going to take time, the physical therapist warned me during our first session. Months, not weeks. But with dedication, you should regain full use of the arm. The pain was constant, varying from sharp spikes when I moved wrong to a deep, persistent ache that no amount of medication seemed to touch. The doctors assured me this was normal, that it would improve with time, but in those early days in the hospital it was hard to believe. Nights were the worst. In the quiet darkness of my hospital room, every shadow seemed to hide teeth and claws. I would wake up gasping, feeling phantom weight on my chest, smelling the bear's breath. The nurses got used to finding me awake during their night rounds, staring out the window at the distant mountains where I knew the grizzlies still roamed. On my last day in the hospital, Dr. Chun gave me final instructions and prescriptions, antibiotics, pain medication, wound care supplies. But her last words stuck with me the most. "You're incredibly lucky," she said, her expression serious. "I've treated other bear attack victims. Many of them didn't make it to the hospital. Whatever you did out there, you did it right." I nodded, but I knew the truth. I hadn't done anything right. I'd ignored warnings, made stupid decisions, broken every rule of bear safety. I had survived through pure luck and the grace of whatever gods watch over fools in the wilderness. As I was wheeled out to my waiting cab, I couldn't help but look toward the mountains rising in the distance. Somewhere up there, a massive grizzly bear was going about its life, probably already having forgotten our encounter. I knew I never would. 6 weeks after the attack, I found myself back at Glacier Peak, my hands sweating on the steering wheel of my rental car. Ranger Sarah Whitaker sat in the passenger seat, her presence both reassuring and a mandatory condition of my return to the site. "We don't have to do this," she said quietly, noting my white-knuckled grip. "Nobody would think less of you for turning back." I shook my head. "I need to see it. Need to make it real somehow. The whole thing feels like a nightmare I can't quite wake up from." The dirt road was exactly as I remembered it, though it felt strange approaching it in broad daylight with a ranger escort. My shoulder, still in physical therapy, ached at the memory of that first drive-in. "The area's been closed to camping since the attack," Sarah explained as we drove. "We've had increased bear activity, probably the same male, marking his expanded territory." We parked at the ranger station and continued on foot. Sarah carried a rifle in addition to her usual bear spray, and I noticed she kept scanning the tree line as we walked. The morning was clear and cool, perfect hiking weather, but every rustle of leaves made my heart rate spike. "The site's just ahead," Sarah said after about 20 minutes of walking. "Are you sure you want to continue?" I nodded, though my legs felt like lead. The clearing looked smaller than I remembered, more ordinary. It was hard to believe that just 6 weeks ago, I had fought for my life here. My shredded backpack was still there, though weather and animals had scattered its contents further. Sarah kept watch while I moved through the site, trying to piece together the fragments of my memory. "Here," I said, touching a tree trunk. "This is where I first saw it." My fingers traced the bark where my bloody handprint had been, now washed away by rain. Sarah made notes in her field book. "Can you show me the direction it came from?" I pointed toward the tree line. "There. It emerged from the mist right about." My voice trailed off as I spotted something dark matted in the undergrowth. Sarah followed my gaze and moved closer to investigate. "Bear fur," she confirmed, collecting a sample in a small evidence bag. "And look at these marks." She pointed to a nearby tree where deep claw marks scored the bark about 8 feet up. "This is definitely his territory. He's been marking these trees regularly." My chest tightened, the scars beneath my shirt seeming to burn with remembered pain. "How big would you say he is, based on these marks?" Sarah studied the claw heights. Given the marking height and the fur color, probably around 600 to 700 pounds. One of the largest males in this area. We continued through the site, Sarah documenting everything while I tried to reconcile my nightmarish memories with the peaceful clearing before me. The track of my desperate flight through the forest was still visible in places: broken branches, disturbed earth, and... "There. This is where it happened," I said, stopping at the bottom of the small embankment where I'd fallen. This is where it caught me. The ground still showed signs of the struggle. A depression where the bear had pinned me. Strips of my shredded clothing caught in nearby bushes. Sarah photographed everything methodically while I stood there, lost in memory. The pepper spray canister should be around here somewhere, I said, more to distract myself than anything else. Sarah nodded. We found it during the initial investigation. Standard procedure for documenting bear encounters. She paused in her note-taking to look at me. You know, what you did. Using the spray at that range with a dislocated shoulder. It's pretty remarkable. Most people freeze up completely in close encounters. I laughed, a hollow sound. I did everything wrong leading up to that moment. Ignored your warnings. Hiked alone. Ran when I should have stood my ground. Maybe, she agreed. But you also did the one thing that mattered most. You survived. We spent another hour at the site, Sarah completing her documentation while I tried to exorcise my demons. The ranger's presence and the daylight helped make the clearing seem more mundane, less like the setting of a horror movie. The bear's been back here regularly, Sarah said as we prepared to leave. These markings are fresh, probably from the last few days. He's clearly established this as part of his core territory now. Will you relocate him? I asked, surprised by my own mixed feelings about the possibility. Sarah shook her head.
No.
He's behaving normally for a dominant male grizzly. The attack, while traumatic for you, was defensive rather than predatory. This is his home, we're the visitors here. As we walked back to the ranger station, I found myself looking over my shoulder less frequently. The forest felt different now, not safe exactly, but comprehensible. The bear wasn't some movie monster or demon, just a wild animal defending its territory. You'll submit your report? I asked as we reached the vehicles. Yes, but it won't change much, Sarah replied. The area will remain closed to camping for the season, and will maintain the increased warnings about bear activity. But that's standard procedure. I nodded, understanding now what I couldn't 6 weeks ago. The bear was never found because there was no reason to find it. It wasn't a problem to be solved or a villain to be punished. It was simply a grizzly bear being a grizzly bear. As we drove away from Glacier Peak, I caught a glimpse of movement in the trees, probably just a deer or elk, but for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a familiar massive shape moving through the shadows. The bear was still out there, ruling its territory as it had before our encounter and would continue to do long after. The only difference was the scars we both carried, mine on my body. His perhaps still feeling the phantom burn of pepper spray when the wind blew a certain way. In the end, we had both simply been players in an ancient drama, predator and prey, wilderness and civilization, each of us acting according to our nature. The only unusual part was that both of us had walked away to tell the tale. A year has passed since the attack. The physical scars have faded to silvery lines across my chest and back, barely visible unless you know what you're looking for. My shoulder, after months of grueling physical therapy, has regained most of its range of motion, though it still aches when storms approach. But the mental scars run deeper. This morning, like many mornings, I woke in a cold sweat, the bear's roar echoing in my mind. The dream is always the same. Amber eyes, hot breath, the weight on my chest, the certainty of death. My therapist says this is normal, that trauma takes time to process. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever process it completely. You had the dream again? My wife asked, finding me on the back porch, coffee growing cold in my hands as I stared at the tree line behind our house. Yeah, I admitted, though it's different now, less immediate, like watching a movie of something that happened to someone else. She wrapped her arms around me carefully, mindful of how I still flinch when touched unexpectedly. You're healing, she said simply. The local hiking groups still tell my story around campfires. I know because my friend Mark, who leads weekend expeditions, told me how it's become part of the standard safety briefing. You're practically an urban legend now, he said over beers last week. The man who fought the grizzly, though the story gets more dramatic with each telling. Last week, someone claimed you fought it off with a hunting knife. I had to laugh at that. Pretty sure I'd be dead if I tried that. The bear spray barely worked as it was. That's why I tell your real story, Mark said, his expression growing serious. It's better than the embellished versions. Shows what actually happens when things go wrong in bear country. He's right. My story has become a cautionary tale, passed around by guides and rangers throughout the region. Not because it's particularly unique, bear attacks happen every year in grizzly country, but because it hits that sweet spot between horror and hope. A reminder that the wilderness deserves respect, but also that survival is possible even when everything goes wrong. The scars tell their own story. During my last physical therapy session, my therapist traced the longest one, running from just below my right shoulder blade to the middle of my back. These have healed beautifully, she said. Much better than I expected given the initial injury reports. I nodded, remembering Dr. Chen's words in the hospital about how lucky I was. They don't hurt anymore. Just remind me. Remind you of what? I had to think about that. That I'm not invincible. That nature doesn't care about our plans or precautions. That survival sometimes comes down to pure luck. I've returned to camping, though never alone. Last month, I joined Mark's group for a weekend trip in the Cascades. It was different territory, black bear country rather than grizzly, but my heart still raced every time a branch cracked in the darkness. You're doing better, Mark observed around the campfire. Last time we came out, you jumped at every sound. Practice, I said, trying to smile. And Xanax. The others laughed, but I noticed they all checked their bear spray before turning in for the night. My story had made them more cautious, and maybe that's the best legacy I could hope for from the whole ordeal. I still check the local reports from Glacier Peak obsessively. The area where I was attacked remained closed to camping for 6 months, though it's open again now. The big male grizzly is still there. Rangers have documented his presence through tracks and markings, though he's never attacked anyone else. Sometimes I find myself wondering about him. Does he remember our encounter? Does the scent of humans trigger some memory of pepper spray and blood? Or was I just another brief interaction in his long life in the wilderness, forgotten as soon as his eyes and nose stopped burning? Sarah Whitaker, the ranger who had warned me and later helped me return to the site, sends me updates occasionally. Her latest email included photos of fresh claw marks on trees in the area. He's still king of his territory, she wrote. Getting bigger too. Tracks suggest he's over 700 pounds now. But he's staying deeper in the backcountry, avoiding human contact. Maybe you taught him something too. Last week, I gave a talk at the local REI about bear safety. The irony wasn't lost on me. The guy who did everything wrong now teaching others how to do it right. But maybe that's exactly why they asked me. Bear spray works, I told the audience, showing them the proper way to carry and deploy it. But it should be your last resort, not your only plan. Everything I'm teaching you tonight is about avoiding getting into the situation I found myself in. In the end, it's the little things that stick with me. The way the morning mist swirled around the bear's feet as it approached. The sound of my blood dripping onto leaves. The peculiar golden color of its fur in the sunlight. The complete silence of the forest during the attack, as if the whole world was holding its breath. These memories surface at odd moments, when I'm making coffee, driving to work, shopping for groceries. They're part of me now as much as the scars on my chest and back. But they no longer paralyze me with fear. Instead, they remind me of something essential about life, about survival, about the thin line between civilization and wilderness. Somewhere in the vast backcountry of Glacier Peak, that grizzly still roams. He's doing what bears have done for millennia, hunting, marking territory, following ancient instincts that cared nothing for my presence in his world. Our paths crossed for a few terrifying minutes, and both of us carry the memory of that encounter in our own ways. But life goes on. The wilderness remains wild, and I remain forever changed by those moments when I learned, with absolute clarity, that we are not always at the top of the food chain.